Chapter 322. Years ago, on a remote mineral star at the border between the West Woods region and Bermuda region, Whitewater Company's Team 7 was carrying out a secret mission. By Magnolia was hit in the chest by a piece of hard fiber shrapnel. His ribs were cut open, and blood flowed out like a stream. However, despite suffering such heavy injuries, Bai Yulan didn't make a single sound. She didn't even frown as she led the members of Team 7 to maintain a semicircle defensive formation. Relying on the Federation's advanced weapons and their valiant determination, they successfully held on until reinforcements arrived. For a full 16 minutes, Bai Magnolia, who was wearing a full-body isolation suit, stood behind the self-propelled armored vehicle. He did not retreat a single step until the wide-winged space fighter glided over. Only then did he collapse. That scene fell into the eyes of Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, and the rest of Team 7's combat personnel. It was deeply engraved in their minds until today. So when they saw Bai Magnolia collapse on the street, the anger in their hearts suddenly erupted. The cold murderous intent in their hearts rose to an uncontrollable level. Even with Lan Xiaolong's strict suppression, they could not control it. In the end, the reason why they calmed down a little was because of Bai Magnolia's words. That person was Su Lu. The tip of the knife had injured his lung. It seemed to be a serious injury, but for someone like Bai Magnolia who was born in the military, it was just a small surgery. He quietly laid on the hospital bed and signaled Lan Xiaolong beside him to turn off the automatic electronic anesthesia pump. He frowned and said in a hoarse voice, "Help me light a cigarette." After bleeding so much and undergoing surgery, the first thing a seriously injured person said after waking up was to smoke. The silent people in the ward did not express any shock. For these people in the ward, injuries were a common occurrence. But everyone felt that the knife that Lao Bai was stabbed with today was somewhat indescribable. What was even stranger was that these people in the ward knew very well that Bai Magnolia had stopped smoking after his failed experiment last autumn and was sent to the military court. Why did he want to smoke today? Xiong Linquan lit a cigarette and took 2 puffs to make it burn brighter. He silently put the cigarette between his thin lips. After a moment of hesitation, he asked, "Is that kid really Su Lu?" Bai Magnolia lay on the bed. Other than the new wounds that had been glued together by physiological glue, there were also many old scars on his bare back. He took a puff of his cigarette and said faintly, "During last year's gathering, I told you that if the Department of Defense and the company really wanted to reorganize Team 7, he would be the most important person. He is the leader that I found for everyone." A strange emotion flashed across Xiong Linquan's face. He opened his mouth slightly as if he wanted to curse, but in the end, it only turned into a sigh. Last year, during a few of their occasional gatherings, Bai Yulan had seriously mentioned the current technical director of Team 7. Her words were filled with sincere praise, admiration, and love. After hearing this many times, they naturally started to believe her. Now, Su Lu and I are the only 2 people left in Team 7. He is the technical director, and I am his secretary. Bai Magnolia said softly, "Unfortunately, there won't be such a pairing in the future." Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, and the rest of the people in the room fell silent. The federal military was a place that valued strength and respected the strong. As the combat director of Team 7, Bai Magnolia was once the most outstanding soldier in the federal military. She had given Su Lu such high praise, which naturally made them believe her. However, they didn't understand. Lao Bai clearly liked that young man very much, so why did something like this happen today? Lao Bai didn't even fight back. What exactly happened? Su Lu has a good personality. He treats people well and is very strong. Plus, he has a background in the Department of Defense. I thought that Team 7 would be the best choice to follow him. Bai Magnolia flicked away the ash from her cigarette and said softly, "Unfortunately, it looks like the military will definitely not let you all come back. He must be very disappointed in me. This team will be disbanded in the end." For Bai Yulan and the rest of the people in the room, Team 7 was the place where they had fought and lived. It was their truest history. They constantly wanted the Ministry of Defense to rescind the original order and rebuild Team 7, but all of this seemed so illusory. That Su Lu, is he really the developer of the MX Mecha? Why didn't I see him at the unveiling ceremony of the assembly line last month? Lu Jiao asked with a frown. In fact, he had never doubted Bai Magnolia's praise of that young man, but he just found it somewhat unbelievable. Bai Magnolia naturally wouldn't tell him that at that time, Su Lu had still been locked up in a dark military prison. Xiong Linquan sighed and said, "If you hadn't said it yourself, I really wouldn't have believed that this seemingly normal guy could actually operate a mecha and kill that young lieutenant colonel from the military god's family on the summit of Mount Kaki." Lan Xiaolong, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said, "This is a military secret. It's best not to talk about it." Xiong Linquan laughed coldly and said, "This kind of thing can't be hidden for too long." Lan Xiaolong smiled. Just as he was about to say something, the phone in his hand rang. He walked out of the door. Bai Magnolia, who was lying on the hospital bed, threw away the cigarette butt in her hand. After a moment of silence, she said softly, "What a pity, what a pity." "What's a pity?" asked an officer. "A pity that Team 7 is disbanded just like that. It's one less person who was destined to be the most ferocious person to go to the front lines, or even to the Empire to do some of the most ferocious deeds." Bai Magnolia said softly, "Such a loyal boss, fuck, it would be hard to find a second one in the entire Federation." Lan Xiaolong pushed open the door and entered. He looked at Bai Magnolia with a strange expression, his hands still holding the encrypted military phone he always carried with him. Everyone in the room felt that something was wrong with him, and they all looked over. Lan Xiaolong looked at the outstanding officers in the room, who had been through the flames of war, and shrugged helplessly. He said, "This is the first news that just came out. The War Strategy Office of the Ministry of Defense has issued a written order. The Whitewater Company's Team 7 is officially reorganizing. The transfer order should be on its way to your unit right now." As soon as he said this, the atmosphere in the room suddenly became a little strange. The officers in the room had all fought in Team 7. In the relatively peaceful era, they had fought a life-and-death battle with the Empire's invaders. Although now they were the trump cards of their respective units, as soldiers of the Federation, in the quiet night, how could they not miss the starry battlefields, the mines, the bullet holes, and the past battle scenes? Bai Magnolia's delicate eyes flashed with a glimmer of light. She asked softly, "You're now just a colonel in the garrison area. The Ministry of Defense can't possibly inform you." Lan Xiaolong shrugged again, somewhat innocently. He adjusted his military cap and said, "Remember my mission in Harbor City last year? I was responsible for protecting a certain chief." Bai Magnolia's eyes grew brighter and brighter. She asked, "Who's the new leader of Team 7? Su Lu." Lan Xiaolong smiled and replied, "But it's estimated that there will be an expansion because it seems that the 83-84 division will also be transferring people over. The entire reorganization timetable will take about 3 months." Everyone in the room finally understood what he was talking about. The shock in their hearts could not be erased. Instead, there was a trace of doubt. Even the 17th Armored Division would be transferring people over. What exactly did the Ministry of Defense want to do by reorganizing Team 7? The Capital Special District was just like the other places in the Federation. There were rich and poor like the clouds in the sky, and poor like the black mud. In the barren world of the Donglin District, there were also extremely luxurious nightclubs. In this city, which was the center of the Federation, there were not only places like Linyuan and the Windy Slope Club, but also small restaurants on the streets. To be precise, Su Lu had been released from prison for less than 24 hours, but he had already done a lot of things. He had obtained a special pardon from the president, signed a contract to sell himself to the federal military, and even stabbed someone in the back. At this moment, he was sitting on a chair and taking big mouthfuls of vegetables in sesame oil from the pot. He was sweating profusely and seemed to be very happy. Shi Ziyuan wasn't used to eating in this kind of place. He frowned and looked at the oil stains and stains on the table. He then looked at the pile of food in the big pot. He really didn't have much of an appetite. After being locked in prison for 5 months, what I want to eat the most is something hot or even hot. It's best if it can burn my cold stomach until it hurts. Su Lu put down his chopsticks and explained with a smile. You probably don't want to think about the things I want you to think about. Li Pifu, president, the military, and the others bailed you out. What exactly do they want you to do? Do you know? In front of Su Lu, Tai Ziyuan did not look like the son of a noble family, but the environment he grew up in made him look so elegant when he wiped the corners of his mouth with a paper towel in this small restaurant. However, it was this kind of elegance that was too inconsistent with the environment that Su Lu could not help but laugh. After going through so many things, Su Li's state of mind had changed a lot. He was gradually returning to the orphan from Donglin's Zhonglo Street. Perhaps he did not need to pick up that broken but sharp hydraulic pipe anymore. His state of mind had already returned to that murderous, rainy night. He was still as persevering, stubborn, and cheerful as before. The silence that covered his face was gradually disappearing, and the blocks in his heart turned into sharp stones. Pressing forward courageously was not because he could not see ahead. Although he was a little confused about his future life, the biggest fear and apprehension since escaping from Donglin had disappeared. His identity as a fugitive from the Federation and his secret had already been caught. It was unnecessary to be nervous and silent. It was like an old scar that was always itching. Once it was abruptly removed, although it hurt a little, it was also exceptionally satisfying. Moreover, the Federation's war god seemed to have become his distant relative. He no longer needed to constantly worry about his identity as a fugitive. How could a cheerful young man like Su Lu not be sunny? His eyes were smiling like the 2 moons in the sky. He said, "Why do you care so much? At most, the Ministry of Defense will send me to the front lines as cannon fodder. If I can kill a few more Empire people, it won't be too much of a loss. After all, I should have been a dead man to begin with. I think the government won't spare a mecha genius like you from being cannon fodder." Tai Ziyuan looked at the narrowed eyes of Su Lu in front of him with slight ridicule, and his heart warmed a little. There were still a lot of inside stories that he had not figured out. What was the reason for Li Pifu to come out of seclusion? Why did his mother want him to die? And why was he still alive? Because of all these, Su Li's smiling face seemed somewhat mysterious at this moment. However, as a friend, he did not want to find out what was underneath the mystery. The government is about to make a big move, Tai Ziyuan suddenly said. Su Lu understood the abilities of this young man in front of him very well. He knew that the big move he was talking about was definitely not a small matter. In an instant, the bustling little restaurant seemed to have quietened down. He raised his head seriously. To be precise, it's Mr. Pabre. This big move is related to Green Dragon Mountain. Is there going to be a war? Su Lu asked worriedly. Ever since they found out about Macklin's true identity, anyone who knew the inside story was shocked and fearful of the Empire's ambitions and foresight. The Federation now needed unity more than ever before. If the government attacked Green Dragon Mountain again, who knew what kind of negative effects it would bring? It might even give the Empire some opportunities to take advantage of. No, it's a negotiation. It's to implement the agreement at the end of last year. Tai Ziyuan shook his head. Sitting at the simple table, they were all involved in the big incident that year, and even the masterminds. However, there was still Shi Qinghai, who was currently still locked up in prison. The president will invite the leader of Nanshui to S1 for formal negotiations. If Green Dragon Mountain is really willing to join the government, this will definitely be the most explosive good news in recent years. Of course, the difficulty is also very high. If it wasn't for the fact that the threat from the Empire is too great, it would be very difficult for the government and the parliament to come to a consensus. However, the problem is that we don't know how Green Dragon Mountain is prepared to respond. This is a rare piece of good news. Su-lu put down his chopsticks and was silent for a moment before nodding seriously. If the negotiations are successful, and the anti-government forces are really willing to be incorporated, they will probably transfer a unit to the West Woods to express their attitude. Of course, this is mainly because of the greater symbolic significance. President Pabre is very sincere. The main forces of the 2nd Military Region have already been withdrawn, and the unit I belong to will be transferred to the West Woods to fight in rotation. Tai Ziyuan said calmly, "I'll be leaving tomorrow. Take care." Su-lu said softly, "Perhaps the next time we meet again, we'll both be on the front lines of the West Woods." A trace of worry appeared between Tai Ziyuan's brows. "I'm staying for a few more days mainly because of you." In reality, the situation in the West Woods isn't stable. The 4th Military Region has refused the Joint Chiefs of Staff's order to increase the offensive. That Commander Zhong has guarded the Federation border for so many years and knows the Empire's people much better than we do. The problem is that the Federation needs a small-scale victory right now, to raise morale. My main mission in the West Woods this time is to persuade Commander Zhong. Of the 7 major families in the Federation, the Zhong family in the West Woods was the only one who held military power. Without a doubt, they had always been under pressure from both the Empire's main offensive and the Federation's suspicions. Hearing this, Su-lu couldn't help but think of the little girl on the warship. He wondered how the little princess of the Zhong family looked like now. More importantly, after stabbing Bai Yulan, he still needed to fish Shi Qinghai out and confirm where that Bradley Wei had been sent by Madame Zhong. The next day, Tai Ziyuan disappeared again. Su-lu knew that this friend of his carried the glory and pressure of the 1,000-year-old family. He didn't know if this friend of his could really become the president of the Federation in this long life and satisfy that madame's ambition. He only knew that Tai Ziyuan wasn't necessarily happy. It was just that everyone had their own unique identity. This identity represented many things, and it wasn't something that could be easily shaken off. Su-lu had the ability to change his identity. As long as he changed the chip on the back of his neck, he would be able to tear up the documents from the Ministry of Defense like they were pieces of paper. He would then be able to enter the Federation star system and not have to worry about anything anymore. The problem was that he couldn't change because there were still many people he cared about in this world, such as Shi Qinghai and Zhou Yu. An identity was a real life. Giving up one's identity meant giving up everything in this life. Su-lu wanted to live a life of wandering in the universe. He didn't know if he would end up like his uncle if he changed his life too much. He didn't know if he would end up like his uncle and become a loner who couldn't return home. Other than going to the sanatorium to visit prostitutes and order around his useless students, he was actually a lonely mess with no one to talk to or drink with. In the following days, he nervously made a call to Madame Zhong. From her vague answer, he roughly knew Li Wei's whereabouts and confirmed that he was safe. Then, he went to the Zhou family in the West Mountain compound to visit Minister Zhou Yingxing. At the same time, he had a private discussion with Zhou Yu about many things. He basically spent the rest of his time negotiating with the relevant departments. He was now cheerful and sunny. Because he had nothing to lose, he had nothing to fear. Therefore, he was seeking Shi Qinghai's special pardon. The problem was that the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense was not willing to intervene at all, and the president's official residence refused to pick up a call from a nobody like him. As for the relevant departments that could decide these things, it was really confusing. Today, it was this department, tomorrow it was that committee. The doors of the relevant departments were always closed to him. He didn't know about President Pabre's highly targeted speech at the Nebula Awards ceremony a few days ago. He had been busy during this period of time. It wasn't until one day when he saw the article by Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood in the Capital Special District Daily that he found out about what was happening in the Federation. The negotiations between the Federation government and Green Dragon Mountain were unanimously supported by hundreds of millions of people in the Federation. In the face of the evil invaders of the empire, the citizens were really unwilling to see their own internal bloodshed. What was more eye-catching was that the government's Ministry of Justice had once again launched the Medellin special case. Senator Medellin was a spy of the empire. This shameful matter to the Federation would probably be locked in the central database forever and kept a secret. However, just based on the investigation of the terrorist attack that had gathered a lot of evidence last year, it was enough to sentence the dead man in absentia. The Federation would not allow such a person to enjoy the respect of the people after his death. This move would probably anger some of the loyal Medellin youth soldiers, but the shocking news of the government starting negotiations with Green Dragon Mountain covered up too much of their emotions. At this moment, President Pabre and the government had the sincere support of the whole society. Even if there were some demonstrations, they wouldn't cause much of a stir. President Pabre's timing to restart the Medellin special case was perfect. It fully demonstrated his increasingly skilled political skills and wise political wisdom. The Federation began to smear dirty vintage ink on the dead Medellin, but no one dared to stand up and oppose the investigation like those in the previous era. In order to prevent the investigation from implicating them and smearing the ink on their faces, they were like those in the previous era. Including the fortune-tellers who had a very deep relationship with Medellin, they all maintained absolute silence. Taking advantage of this rare opportunity where the 7 major families of the Federation were collectively silent, the government's Ministry of Finance and the Tax Committee jointly attacked. On the 17th of June, Parliament Hill passed the gold fusion algorithm that had been debated for decades. The information disclosure that George Carlin had mentioned in his book all those years ago was a huge step forward. However, the financial giant of the Federation, the Iron Mathletes, suffered a heavy blow. Su Lu was gratified to see the news, and then he finally received his transfer arrangements. To his surprise, the Ministry of Defense did not send him to the armored division on the front line of the West Woods. Instead, he was sent to a mysterious training base in a military vehicle. Chapter 323. Firstly, I've already updated today. Secondly, I drank some wine with my friends after returning home. Last night, I sat in front of the computer and read a lot of books. Suddenly, I felt a little lost. I haven't felt a chill in a long time, but last night, I suddenly felt a lot of emotions. My novels have been a little sticky in recent days. This is my problem. Probably because I don't have enough time and have too many things on my mind. That's why I want to mess around. Now that I think about it, when I used to write in the past, I could often write that I was very high. But ever since I killed Macklin, I don't think I've been high. How can I be more high? I have to write more freely. I'm writing too regularly now. The updates are also too regular. I'm too serious, but it's also too dense. I still have some miscellaneous matters to attend to in the past few days. From the 23rd onwards, I plan to write more freely. So on the surface, I'll update every day, but I'll write more. I won't set a task for myself. Otherwise, I'll feel relaxed every time I write a few thousand words. I'll be lazy. I have to write better. I have to write more. If I'm in the right mood in the future, I'll write more. Anyway, I'll definitely write more than what I'm writing now. Don't worry, everyone. The reason why I suddenly have so many bullshit thoughts and feelings is because today is my birthday. I'm 32 years old. Looking back, I can't say that I haven't accomplished anything, but I always feel that I can do better. The only thing I'm lacking is that one word, seriousness. All that I've said is to give myself some pressure. I'm a lazy person who can't live without pressure. In the future, I'll be more serious about my work and life and writing. I'll be able to endure these fewer and fewer days with everyone. Chapter 324. Su Lu had always thought of himself as an illiterate person. During his youth, he was forced by Uncle Fengyu to spend most of his free time in Heshi State University's free library, apart from repairing electrical appliances on Xianglan Avenue and in the mine. He carefully studied no less than 200 books related to mechanical repair, such as microelectronics, structural design, and material science. He even forced himself to read a lot of books related to the humanities, such as Schiller's opera scripts, ancient Federation songs, and even seriously read the Federation's painting appreciation dictionaries. But these were all things that Uncle Feng had asked him to do, and with so many things crammed into his brain, apart from mechanical repair, he never had the opportunity to turn his memory into performance. When he was with Zhang Xiaomeng in the plum garden, love always happened in the cafeteria and on the field, so he didn't find the time to memorize those love poems that had been passed down through the ages. After that, his life was even more difficult and dangerous, so naturally, he didn't have the time to go to the capital's Metropolitan Art Gallery and express his views on art. Li Qishao's apartment had many famous paintings, but at that time, his eyes had already been burned by those flowers, so there was no reason for him to start praising the strange impressionist style of painting. The most important thing was that he didn't have a proper education. The Federation's free educational benefits for orphans had long been thrown aside by him. And he didn't have the opportunity to take the Ministry of Defense's mechanical repair exam, which he had been looking forward to, so to this day, he still didn't have a single diploma. People without a diploma were illiterate. This was the opinion of most people in the Federation, including Su Lu himself. So he had been greedily absorbing the nutrients of knowledge around him. In these 2 years, at Yue University, at the Research Institute, at the Whitewater Company, and at the engineering department, he constantly learned from those professors, Tai Ziyuan, and Bai Yulan, and very honestly put himself in the position of a good student. A guy without a diploma had now become an instructor of the Ministry of Defense. This kind of change made him unable to react for a while, and it was very difficult for him to adapt. The officers who were sitting upright in the training base also found it hard to get used to the fact that their instructor was actually a guy who looked younger than them and was so ordinary that they couldn't look at him. The base was not a military academy, and these officers were not ordinary military academy students. They were the best of the best selected from the Federation's anti-terrorism exercise. Although they still maintained strict discipline in class and sat abnormally straight, there was a sense of alienation and coldness in their eyes and eyebrows. In the end, it converged into a look of disdain as they looked at the podium. A young technical officer from the General Assembly base was actually sent here to explain to these battle-hardened soldiers the controls of the Federation's newest MX mecha. Due to the prominent role of mecha in the planetary landing field army and the glorious deeds of the old military god, regardless of whether it was the 3 major military academies or the Westwoods Military Academy, the mecha faculty had always had the highest status. Logistical support and the strength of their teachers were all placed first. The officers in training were forced to watch that video and study the anti-terrorism assault array for 2 months before they finally received notice that they were about to begin learning how to operate the Federation's newest MX mecha. This was extremely good news, because they all knew very well what the revolutionary MX mecha meant to future battles. Last month, the General Assembly base had just begun listing the MX into the production sequence. They would definitely be the first batch of MX pilots in the military. This kind of glory and pressure filled them with anticipation and excitement for today's class. They had originally thought that the one coming to class today would definitely be a professor from the First Military Academy's mecha faculty, or perhaps the most terrifying ace pilot of the federal military. Who would have thought that such a young man would come instead? The difference between expectations and reality made the officers feel somewhat frustrated. Naturally, conflicting emotions rose in their hearts. The Ministry of Defense had not prepared a lesson plan, only giving Su Lu a question. However, when he received this question, Su Li's emotions calmed down a lot. Although he knew that he was definitely not an outstanding instructor, when it came to the MX mecha, there was probably no one in the entire Federation who was more familiar with it than he was. Thinking of this, he vaguely understood how the Federation was planning to use him. Making the best use of time to train a batch of capable MX pilots for the military was indeed the most important thing right now. He noticed the strange looks from the officers below the podium, but he did not care. Due to the discipline of the class, none of these officers dared to make a fuss or cause trouble in class. The key was that there might be some small problems during the discussion later. He hoped that Zhou Yu would be able to help out later. He looked at Zhou Yu's smiling face at the front of the class and could not help but smile. Then, he wiped the smile from his face. He slid the touch ball under his thumb to bring up the diagram of the mecha's shoulder on the screen. Then, he said seriously, when performing the power mutation, all of you must pay attention to how the threshold value of the shoulder rises. The MX's monitoring system is located at the head, just like the old system. However, due to the current instantaneous load being too large, the balance compass may be affected. Therefore, all of you must be more precise in your control and match the threshold value of the shoulder. In the underground base of the Nutshell Engineering Department, he had tested the mecha countless times. Moreover, during his exchange with Mad Manly at the Old Moon base, he had gained a deeper understanding of this new mecha. What he was saying now was undoubtedly a very rare experience. However, it was precisely because he knew this very well that his tone was very certain, almost as if he was giving a straight answer. This kind of tone was rather jarring to the ears of the officers, especially when they saw that Su Lu on the rostrum had already begun to break down the tactical movements of the MX mecha in detail, treating them as if they were his older brothers. This kind of dissatisfaction had accumulated to the extreme. After much difficulty, this lesson on the structure system was finally over. Before Su Lu could say anything, one of the officers stood up with a stern expression and said rudely to him on the rostrum, "I've made a thorough record of the tactical movements you just described. I think that everything you said is wrong. I love my teacher, but I love the truth even more." However, this officer's question was not a discussion, but more like a criticism. This was because the essentials of the mecha movements Su Lu had described seemed completely out of order to them. It was completely incompatible with the tactical movements they had learned in the 3 major military academies back then. They could not imagine how much trouble would arise operating a mecha like this, and so their impression of Su Lu subconsciously worsened. They felt that this person probably had some understanding of the MX mecha, but definitely had some great background and had pulled some strings to be able to become their instructor. Where's the mistake? Su Lu released the finger he had been using to turn off the screen to look seriously at that stern-looking officer. If the E3 turn and side slide were executed according to your instructions, it would only result in a big fall. That officer looked at Su Lu with disgust. The way I see it, you've probably never operated a mecha before. How can someone like you be qualified to teach us? Su Lu lowered his head and thought for a moment before saying, M-Series mecha. I've come into contact with them 3 times. As soon as these words were said, the entire conference room burst into an uproar. Among these most outstanding officers of the federal military present, some were not from the mecha battalions, but they had all participated in the West Woods rotational warfare for the past 10 years. They were very familiar with the mecha of the federal military, some of them had even slept in their mecha every day, yet their instructor had only operated a M-Series mecha 3 times. Su Lu ignored the uproar in the conference room. Picking up the pen in his hand, he quickly drew a rough diagram of the mecha on his terminal screen and displayed it on the screen. Pointing at the diagram on the screen and the precise numbers beside it, he said, E3 turn and side slide. If done according to my instructions, it will definitely achieve the best results. As for the fall you mentioned, I don't think it will happen. The standing officer looked at him coldly and said rudely, "You want to overturn all the teaching materials of the 3 major academies? I haven't thought about that, but speaking of MX, I think you all should listen to my opinion more. After all, I am the instructor." Su Lu was an easily angered person. Although these officers were extremely rude to him, he did not feel too strongly about it. He was only thinking about the mission the Ministry of Defense had given him, and about the advance of the Imperial armies at the West Woods front lines, and his brow furrowed. He felt that these officers who were the pillars of the Federation were all so stubborn, completely unable to understand the biggest difference between the two. Thus, his words sounded rather stern. "I don't think you have the right to be our instructor. I will report this to the higher-ups, said the officer in a deep voice. At the same time, many other officers around them stood up and cast a disdainful glance at Su Lu before preparing to leave the conference room. I know why you all find the standard tactical movements of the MX mecha ridiculous. Su Lu was silent for a moment, and then suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, because you all have stupidly forgotten one thing. Compared to the MX mecha you all commonly use, the MX mecha is a completely new system. If you are satisfied with what you have in the past and want to use the things you have learned to pilot MX, it's like trying to use a bicycle to drive a car. This is truly ridiculous thinking. The leading officer's body stiffened slightly, but he still walked towards the door. However, a trace of doubt flashed across the faces of the officers behind him, and they subconsciously slowed down their steps. Su Lu no longer looked at these people. He drew a few sketches of the structure as fast as he could and marked a few extremely complicated numbers. He looked at the officers who were still sitting below the podium and said, the order given by the Department of Defense was urgent, so I didn't start from the basics at the beginning. I thought that you should be able to understand this, but I didn't expect that you still weren't mentally prepared to control a monster. Then I will dissect this monster with you. Instantaneous quadruple power output, dual control system, cockpit design with fluid replacement, large reduction in long-range firepower, all designed for close combat. This is the MX, a ridiculous monster. He thought to himself that Ka Chifun's battle was still in a semi-secret state, but the development of the MX mecha no longer needed to be kept a secret. After some thought, he stood up and smiled at the officers in the conference room. His name is Su Lu, the main developer of the MX mecha. The main developer of the MX mecha. What did this title mean? These outstanding officers who had studied in the various military academies naturally knew. Connecting the dots to this person's age, in addition to their shock, their slightly furrowed brows gradually relaxed into disbelief. The other developer is not that much older than him, and she's also a lady. Zhou Yu smiled and said, to have the developer personally explain the MX, I think this is a rare opportunity. Even if he really is the developer of the MX mecha, he is not a soldier after all. How can he teach the true tactical movements and controls of the battlefield? The stern-faced officer walked back from the door and said with a cold smile, it's just an armchair strategist. The training base was hidden in the dense mountains. Up until now, Su Lu still had not figured out the exact location. After all, he was not a professional soldier. On the way here on his private jet, he could not pinpoint the exact location just by looking at the sun's position and the direction of the mountain range. After finishing his first class, he walked to the viewing platform of the training field of the base. Putting down the electronic document in his hands, he sat down and sank into silence. The president had signed a special pardon, and he had signed the 2 thin indentures from the Ministry of National Defense. Then, he had been sent to this remote base. He lit a cigarette and narrowed his eyes at the wild grass growing wildly on the training field. For some reason, he actually thought of the scenery outside the window of Qingqing's military prison. If he had been the one to teach those military prisoners about the MX mecha, perhaps it would have been easier to teach than these officers today, right? He thought this somewhat ludicrously. Su Li's personality was one that valued promises above all else. Since he had signed the indenture, he would do this well. Thus, going against his conscience, he played the role of indifference in the meeting room, simulating things like prestige. However, he knew that just based on his understanding of the MX mecha, it was not enough to make those officers truly lower their heads. Instructors and students were natural enemies. The greater the pressure, the greater the resistance. It was just that this instructor, Su Lu, was a little too young, and those students were a little too fierce. These soldiers all had academy backgrounds and were already basic-level commanders in their respective units. Just sitting upright in the meeting room gave off the feeling of a powerful army. These past few years, they had killed countless enemies in the West Woods. There was even a sense of pride and ruthlessness that was deeply rooted in their bones. Moreover, it was their profession. Thinking of the word profession, Su-lu could not help but lick his lips and curse under his breath. Profession often meant inflexibility, meant bureaucracy. The bureaucracy of the government and the military could tell from this incident. The new mecha had clearly been successfully developed last year, but in the end, from assembly to training, it had actually dragged on for a full half a year. After he had been released from prison, he had thought that the Federation had already trained countless skilled MX pilots. In the end, he had not expected that he would still have to do this himself. After fiercely smoking a cigarette, Su-lu stood up and walked towards the dormitory. He thought to himself, I've killed as many people as you all. If we want to compete, I can only pretend for you all to see. Chapter 325. The fresh blood of the military who had been specially groomed by the Federation might have had the word fresh in them, but they were definitely not true rookies. These officers who had been trained were at least the fellows of a Special Forces company commander in their own base, and were also admired by the leaders of their respective units, doted on like treasures. Thus, although they could not be said to be truly arrogant and willful, there was definitely an aloof attitude in their eyes that treated everyone else as if they were nothing. In terms of overall strength, these officers were unquestionably among the best in the federal military. Otherwise, their units would not have chosen them to participate in the joint exercise. Losing so badly in front of their brother units, other than losing face, there was no other benefit. A certain person's mecha control was ferocious, able to break through the fourth level of the test with an M37. A certain person's face was not red nor was he out of breath after injuring a target with a combination of firearms, and he could even pretend to be a scarecrow in a grain field. A certain person hid in a swamp during the exercise and did not show his face for 7 days. In the end, it was only when the staff of the 1st Military Region, the organizer of the exercise, had almost checked the data of the Bureau of Proclamation that he floated out like a ghost to tail behind the pursuit team, silently performing a great comeback. Each of them had their own strengths that could not be replicated, so it was very difficult to determine a true victor. Moreover, they were all characters who had once fought in turn in the West Woods. Perhaps they had even supported each other on the battlefield back then, so the officer cadets themselves were able to respect each other and live in harmony. However, after the anti-terrorism exercise ended, these prodigious soldiers were locked up in the training base for several months of training. Before the new year, the federal military had suddenly raised the security level. Coupled with the rare anti-terrorism joint exercise, although they had not received any clear orders, they knew that the situation between the Federation and the Empire was definitely becoming tense again. However, at such a critical time, they were unable to return to their own units and fight alongside their comrades. Instead, they were locked up in this godforsaken base in silence. How could they not be frustrated? It had to be said that the reason Su-lu had attracted so many conflicting emotions during the first lesson of the new MX mecha had a lot to do with the emotions of the officers about to erupt. The trainees received comprehensive training at the base, and the Federation attached great importance to it. It was obvious that they were preparing for this batch of officers to grow into generals who could command an area on the battlefield. Thus, they had set up many courses, among which were courses on command and tactical deduction. Among the 19 courses, the course on the new mecha, which had started less than 2 days ago, was particularly unremarkable. However, this was the class that the officers didn't want to attend the most right now, because they realized that the young instructor that they had once disregarded and looked down upon was really a good-for-nothing. The holographic screen in the conference room flashed with structural blueprints and core data that were constantly changing. Su-lu stood on the podium, coldly looking at the officers below the podium, and said in a calm tone, he said calmly, the base covers an area of 47 square kilometers, and that doesn't include the wilderness mountain area behind it. The Federation has set up such a large area and invited the best teachers from the 3 major military academies just to train the 30 or so of you. In the end, you've spent 4 days and still haven't grasped the most basic tactical movements. Each time an officer below raised an objection, Instructor Su-lu would be able to report precise data even with his eyes closed, sharply and coldly mocking the crowd. And in practice after class, the officers could not help but angrily find that everything he said was right. If one did not understand the MX mecha as well as one's own body, how could one possibly be able to deduce the fluctuations in the parameters of the mecha's movements just from the data in one's mind? Practice was the only standard to test the truth. In the military camp, only the strong were the standard. In terms of MX mecha operation theory, the officers were shocked to find that no matter how hard they tried, they could not seem to compare to the instructor on the rostrum. Thus, these past few days, when the instructor had been harshly mocking and even scolding them, they could only forcefully suppress their anger, patiently waiting for a chance to take revenge in the future. You can still jump up and kick someone when you're operating the prototype MX, but you can only move your mecha slowly like a little girl. This sentence was too harsh, too cruel. The stifling silence in the classroom was mixed with the sound of angry breathing. Seated at the front, Zhou Yu's expression could not help but turn ugly. He lowered his head and laughed bitterly in his heart. Because he was that person who had been kicked by Su Lu with the prototype MX, someone. That had been 2 years ago at Pear Blossom University. At that time, Zhou Yu had already felt that Su Lu was a genius at mecha operation, but he could never have imagined that in such a short time, Su Lu would already become a level 1 mecha instructor of the Ministry of Defense, and Zhou Yu himself would become his student. I know you all are very capable people, because I am different from you. I believe in the vision of the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense chose me to teach you all naturally because I have the qualifications to do so. Since the Ministry of Defense chose you all, then you all are naturally also excellent soldiers, and have the right to be proud. This seemed to be what an instructor should be doing, first hammering the students a little, then slightly restoring the others' confidence. The atmosphere in the classroom relaxed slightly, but unexpectedly, Su Lu continued coldly, but, in mecha class, in front of me, you all have no right to be proud. If you want to deal with me, you all need to pass the mecha operation test first, and then try to challenge me. I don't have the time or the time of the Empire to play these childish games with you all. The federal officers, who had been humiliated by Instructor Su's words these days, had long been thinking about how to find a suitable opportunity to compare notes with Instructor Su on the podium, who seemed to only know how to talk on paper. However, they did not expect that Instructor Su seemed to have guessed this point and decisively erased this possibility. He even reprimanded their idea of a challenge as childish. Hearing these words, Zhou Yu, who was sitting in the front row, finally could not help but raise his head to glance at Su Lu on the rostrum. Deep confusion appeared on his usually gentle face. He thought to himself, with your mecha combat ability, it's more than enough to take care of a few of the fiercest ace mecha pilots in the class. One battle would be enough to determine the instructor's dignity, so why not do that? What made Zhou Yu even more confused was this Instructor Su on the rostrum really the Su Lu he knew? This cold instructor who wore sunglasses in the classroom, whose lips were as sharp as a knife, and whose face was as cold as the snow in Lin Hai University, was he really that mechanic who always had a smile on his face and a face full of sunshine? Finally, an officer could not control his emotions under Su Li's incisive insults. He stood up abruptly and angrily protested, even if the tactical standard movements you designed are the only correct ones, we are indeed trying to familiarize ourselves with them. But why is there a mecha mechanic aspect in your assessment criteria? A brand new suspension system, and a fitting program for the spherical joint, that's a whole 3 big books. How can we learn in such a short time? Don't forget that we are frontline officers, not mecha soldiers. He looked angrily at Su Lu and said, you've been unwilling to go on the mecha all this time. Is it because you're afraid of being exposed? You're a captain, I'm a lieutenant colonel. You're a student, I'm an instructor. I didn't ask you to stand up, but you stood up. Su Lu stood on the rostrum and looked at him coldly. Count yourself how many rules you've broken. Go run 3 laps on the field yourself. I'll answer your questions to the other students. If the answer is already over by the time you run back, you can ask someone else. After saying this, he adjusted the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose. From the start of the second class, Sulu began to wear the brand new lieutenant colonel uniform to class. He wore sunglasses and had the purple star medal pinned to his chest. The military rank and medal were the rewards he had received for developing the MX mecha. That day, he had thrown them into a pile of snow after leaving the Lufeng Slope clubhouse. Now, the Ministry of Defense had arranged a new one for him. Originally, Madman Li was the only lieutenant colonel at such a young age in the Federation. Now, Su Lu was added. Even Tai Ziyuan, who had achieved great merit in the S2 secret mission and gotten first place in the anti-terrorist exercise, who had the support of a 1,000-year-old family, was still only a major. When Su Lu walked into the classroom wearing the lieutenant colonel uniform, the officers below suddenly became silent. They were of different ages, but even those who were over 30 years old were only majors at most. However, this young instructor was actually a lieutenant colonel. Sulu wanted to complete the mission of the Ministry of Defense in the shortest amount of time possible, so he didn't have the leisure to mingle with the officers. He simply came here with his horse, using his identity as an instructor to suppress the students, using his identity as a senior officer to suppress the officers, and using the honor of the Purple Star Medal to suppress the other party's honor. If it were up to him, he would have hung the Purple Star Medal on his chest. Unfortunately, that incomparably precious medal was obtained from assassinating Macklin. In the foreseeable future, it would have to be hidden in a dusty box. Even so, the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation, the holder of the Purple Star Medal, and a first-class instructor in the Ministry of Defense. These three identities were like three mountains weighing down on the hearts of the officers below the podium, causing them to be vigilant, shocked, and silent. In their silence, they still thought that this young instructor who wore sunglasses in class during the day was probably an arrogant guy who only knew how to show off. They were waiting for the day when he would show off and ignite the anger of the entire base. However, later on, reality proved them wrong. This young instructor's background was even greater than they had imagined. In the midst of the chaos caused by Instructor Su, the senior officers in charge of the discipline of the base actually completely followed his lead. They had even specially sent several military police officers to maintain order during the mecha class according to his request. Hearing this, the officer was stunned. Looking at the instructor's lieutenant colonel uniform and the Purple Star Medal, he knew that he had been blinded by anger and let the instructor have something against him. He then looked at the military police officers who were eyeing him with hostility at the door of the meeting room. He couldn't help but grumble bitterly, took off his military cap, and walked out. Why do you want to learn mechanical structure and maintenance? This is another very stupid question. After the officer who had violated discipline left to run, Sulu adjusted the sunglasses on his nose and said coldly, "This only proves once again your inflexibility and stupidity." Mechanical repair camp? On the battlefield, if the entire mechanical repair camp is wiped out, and you guys are left empty-handed with the spare parts in the supply depot but can't even deal with the mecha's self-damage, what will you do then? There's another very important point. The MX mecha's main use on the battlefield, aside from direct attacks, is for long-distance special operations. Back then, Marshal Li ambushed the Empire's emperor from thousands of miles away and killed the enemy chief in one fell swoop. Does he still have mechanical engineers by his side? Ridiculous. An officer raised his hand silently. Sulu squinted at this person through his sunglasses and found that it was the person who had walked out first during the first class. Suppressing the curve of his lips that was about to curve up, Sulu said coldly, "Ask." This officer's surname was Hua, and his name was Xiaoxi. He belonged to the 4th Military Region's Special Mecha Team. These past few years, he had operated the M52 mecha on the front lines of the West Woods. Who knew how many battles he had fought with the Empire's people? His control of military mecha was exceptionally strong. In his mind, the only person in the entire Federation who was worthy of his admiration in terms of mecha control was the god of war Li Pifu, Commander Zhong, and the retired Commander Tian. Even the current commander was not worthy of his respect. As for these outstanding officers in the base, he only thought that Zhou Yu, who had come from the 1st Military Academy's mecha department, had the ability to compete with him in terms of mecha combat. It was precisely this strong self-confidence that made him extremely dissatisfied with those tactical movements Su Lu had proposed during the first class, and he had taken the initiative to raise his doubts. However, after so many days of class, Hua Xiaoxi understood that the instructor Su on the podium was truly talented. Although he did not know what his actual control level was, his theoretical level was definitely second to none. A trace of respect gradually grew in his heart, but this trace of respect was instantly wiped clean by Su Li's cold reprimand and humiliation. He stood up and saluted Su Lu on the podium. There was no fault in any of his movements, and he said in a low voice, reporting to instructor, "The Federation only has one god of war. You cannot expect every pilot to have that kind of ability, so I think that you can learn about mecha, but not too much." Su Lu looked at him, and after a moment of silence, suddenly said, "Have you seen the movie where Marshal Li assassinated the Emperor of the Empire?" "Yes." In fact, everyone in the conference room had seen it, but they did not understand why Su Lu would ask this. Su Lu continued expressionlessly, "The movie is all fake. If you have paid attention to the war situation report sent by the Department of Defense back then, you should know that back then, on that resource planet within the Empire, Marshal Li ran for thousands of miles. Along the way, his mecha's assembly system nearly broke down 3 times. Marshal Li used local materials for all of them, obtaining parts and components from his own mecha on the battlefield. He even modified the mecha that the Empire left behind in the mountains. That was how he managed to support the M37 to the end. If Marshal Li was as clueless about mecha mechanics as you all are, how could he have accomplished such a shocking feat? In fact, this is what I admire the most about Marshal Li. To be able to drive a broken, and kill the Emperor of the Empire. He praised loudly, "This is really not something a human can do." So, to become a real pilot, first of all, you must learn how to be a mecha mechanic. Su Lu looked at the officers below the podium and said coldly, "The Federation's military regulations have never had such a rule. This is my opinion. Because MX is different, I think that since the Department of Defense asked me to train you all, they must agree with my opinion on MX. But, we are not the war god after all." Hua Xiaoxi shook his head with a serious expression. A soldier who does not want to become a marshal is not a good soldier. After saying this, Su Lu looked at the thoughtful expressions of Hua Xiaoxi and the officers below the podium, and suddenly fell into silence. Training pilots for the Department of Defense, pretending to be cold, but as time passed, he found that he had actually sunk into this kind of role-playing. These young officers below the podium, full of vigor and strength, would soon step onto the battlefield to welcome the great battle with the Empire, and these officers who were destined to become the elites of the military were his own students. Thinking of this, a faint sense of pride grew in his heart. After pausing for a moment, he said seriously, "Not to mention that you are not soldiers, but officers. Don't forget that when Marshal Li went to kill the Emperor of the Empire, he was only the commander of the 17th Armored Division. He was just a soldier like you, but he dared to do so, so he is no longer a human, but a war god. During the first assessment, I hope that some of you can pass. Maybe after the training, it will be difficult for us to meet again, or maybe you don't want to remember my name at all, but I still want to say that my name is Su Lu. I am Instructor Su, in the ancient language, that is Teacher Hu. Of course, with your knowledge reserve, you definitely don't know much about the ancient language." After mocking as usual, Su Lu adjusted the sunglasses on his nose again and left the conference room. On the shore of Lake Feicheng, under the reflection of the snowy mountains, a general stood behind an old man in casual clothes, pulled up the video on the holographic screen, and said with a smile, "Father, he said you are not human." The war god of the Federation, Li Pifu, smiled. The age spots on his forehead were particularly obvious, and his old voice sounded, "To be able to disregard life and death and throw away the instincts of living creatures, at that moment, you really can't be called a human. This little guy has had many inhuman experiences, so it is a good choice for Zhou Yingxing to make him an instructor." But I still have expectations for this little guy. After the training, let him go back to Whitewater. He is too young. For some reason, Major General Lee looked at the screen and smiled bitterly. He felt a little disappointed and said something that seemed to have nothing to do with what he was saying. Li Pifu sat quietly by the lake, looking at the reflection of the snowy mountains in the distance, and said with a smile, "Don't worry too much, just let nature take its course." If I remember correctly, they know each other, and have met each other more than once. Major General Lee had never learned to disobey his father in his life. The old man on the shore of Lake Feicheng was his father, but his more important identity was the war god who protected the Federation. Although he couldn't understand why his father paid so much attention to the young man, and even made some decisions that he felt were inconceivable, he believed that his father must have seen the future many years in the future. The foggy future was something that he couldn't see through, and was unwilling to touch. Those sunglasses don't seem to be his. They are a bit loose, and he wants to pretend to be cold, but he looks a bit funny. I don't understand what he wants to do. The atmosphere by the lake was a bit silent and weird. Major General Lee forced a smile and mentioned some details in the training base. The old man gently let go of his hand, stood up, and stood on the rock, his eyes full of wisdom and iron will forged on the battlefield. He said slowly, "The young man is eager to teach all he knows to the military, to prove that Mr. President's pardon order is correct." Major General Lee didn't understand what he meant. The old man said with a smile, "The more important he is to the Federation, the more likely that the spy in the prison will be pardoned. I pay attention to Sulu, not only because of his relationship with your uncle, not only because of his ability, but also because of his temperament." The old man fell silent again after hearing this. He thought to himself, if he didn't have the opposite ancient style of caring and righteousness, I wouldn't dare to take such a big risk and use him. Not many people in the Federation knew about the obscure and complicated relationship between Sulu and the Lees of Philadelphia. Even President Pabre and General Miles didn't think of a certain interstellar prodigal uncle, a fugitive from the Federation. Probably only the lady in the back of the mountain knew the whole truth. The senior generals of the federal military only knew that the war god appreciated this young man, so when Zhou Yingxing issued a written order to transfer Su Lu to the training base, no one dared to raise an objection. With such a background, Su Li's treatment in the training base naturally wouldn't be bad. He pushed open the door of the instructor's apartment and walked in. He washed his face with hot water, looked at the blurry face in the mirror, and couldn't help but sigh, rubbing his cheeks hard. He had to play the cold instructor every day, and he almost couldn't even smile anymore. He looked at the face in the mirror with some bitterness, then looked at the sunglasses on the stage. He had borrowed this pair from another instructor, and it was a bit big, so it wasn't very suitable to wear. He knew that the officers in the training base were actually very good, but they hadn't come into contact with the new mecha. There would definitely be people who could pass the next test, but he didn't know what kind of challenge he would face. I don't have any intention of fighting in the arena. He looked at himself, gently clenched his fist, smiled, then picked up the phone and pressed a string of numbers. Chapter 326. Sulu had never planned to use actual combat to establish his authority as an instructor, because he did not have the simulation system with him right now. Before heading to S2 to assassinate Macklin, he had taken out the simulation system from under the workbench and placed it in the safe at Whitewater Company. Now, that expensive workbench had become the evidence of the Federation government, and he did not know whether he still had the authority to enter Whitewater Company, so he could only leave the simulation system there. The call was to Li Xiaotong. After being released from prison, Sulu had not gone to see him, even though he was the first person in the Federation willing to invest in him. Sulu knew from Zhou Yu that the Li family was not in a good situation right now. Because the government and the parliament had continuously passed the gold fusion algorithm, the Li family's influence in the financial industry of the Federation had taken a heavy blow. These measures would not shake the foundation of the Iron family, but as the second in line to the family, Li Xiaotong must be busy right now. From a certain perspective, Su Lu should be the Li family's irreconcilable enemy, but he had always maintained some kind of tacit relationship with 7th young Master Li. Now that Su Lu had gained the favor of the Lis of Philadelphia, just this point alone could convince Li Xiaotong to invest a second time and maintain this almost friendly relationship, and the upper echelons of the Li family could only acquiesce. Su Lu needed 7th young Master Li's help to reassemble the simulation system. In fact, even without the help of the simulation system, he believed that he could still defeat this batch of officer students in the base by operating the MX mecha. However, Zhou Yu had seen the Battle of Kachim Peak with his own eyes. If the difference in skill level was too great, it might arouse his suspicion. After all, this gentle gentleman had too close a relationship with Ma Chou at the back of the mountain, so Su Lu had to be careful. More importantly, if he could not display Madman Li's level of battle prowess in battle and obtain an overwhelming victory, then even if he won this battle, what was the point? She had signed a contract to sell her body and was transferred by the Department of Defense to serve a group of military officers. This was not happiness at all. However, everyone had a different view of happiness. Su Lu rubbed his cheeks and looked at himself in the mirror with a smile. He began to carefully shave his beard. He thought of the difficult days in the black prison and how he no longer had to worry about his identity as a fugitive. Every time he washed his face, he no longer had to trim his eyebrows. He felt endless happiness. The training base in the mountains went from early summer to late summer, and then the autumn wind gradually rose, but it couldn't blow away the summer heat. The days passed by in such a boring manner. Although the officers from the various units were still angry, they were exceptionally serious in their learning and training. In the underground mecha storeroom, the 3MX standard mecha were actually trained night after night, lined up by the officers to train them. Although they were not frail bodies, it was still extremely tiring. Su Lu really hadn't expected that his simple provocation of disdain would actually have some effect. These officers were clearly all academically trained soldiers who had graduated from military academies. Their IQ and EQ couldn't be low, so how was it that things were going according to his plan? After thinking about it, he could only attribute this to the atmosphere of the military camp. Although there was also deception in the military, it was still a distance away from society after all. It retained a rare sense of simplicity. These officers had been in the military for a long time, so the simple and direct part of their bodies had manifested. Perhaps some of them roughly understood Instructor Su's intentions, but no one would give him a good attitude. They just kept their heads down and trained, waiting for the beautiful day to come when they passed the assessment and beat the instructor up. Simple and direct was very much in line with Su Li's personality, so these days, he kept his usual sullen face, playing the role of a cold and disdainful instructor. He wasn't worried about the arrival of that day. Instead, through the new sunglasses that Zhou Yu had sent him, he looked with interest at these officers who were howling as if they had taken aphrodisiac and had nowhere to vent their energy. He thought to himself, so the military is actually such a simple place. There was no ready-made tutorial for the MX training, so Su Lu had to compile everything on the spot. Moreover, the MX in the nutshell production department and the assembly line of the main assembly base had undergone many minor adjustments compared to the prototype designed by Su Lu and Shang Qiu. He also didn't have any teaching experience, so every day, teaching classes was actually a very painful process. Fortunately, he had obtained a lot of information from the Nutshell Production Company through the Ministry of Defense, and had also applied for permission to work remotely with Shang Qiu. In addition, he had the experience of training in Area H1 of Yue University's library, so he was able to do this job with great difficulty. Sometimes, Su Lu would feel a little smug. The federal military probably really needed this teaching material. If he could do this job well, wouldn't Mr. Shi's special pardon order be issued? Other than tormenting himself with the MX mecha training, Su Lu was also silently paying attention to the situation in the West Woods and the movements within the Federation. The Federation's proverb had once said, even after leaving the palace of His Majesty and being amongst the stars, one still could not forget the troubles of the world. Su Lu knew what kind of intelligence this imperial spy had sent back, but he didn't know when the next war would break out. The Federation government was anxiously waiting, and so was he. But first came the good news that the leader of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army, Nan Shui, was visiting the capital. In these peaceful days, the first gust of autumn wind at the beginning of September brought another batch of students to the training base. Su Lu, who had been ordered by the base's commanding officer to receive them, saw the dozen or so men jumping out of military vehicles at the entrance of the base. His eyes narrowed involuntarily. Autumn had not yet arrived, but he could already feel the chill. There were a total of 17 men, some of them tall and sturdy, some of them lean and strong, some of them cold and ruthless. They were not wearing military uniforms, but they exuded a murderous aura from head to toe. However, some of them could hide this murderous aura with just a slight turn of their bodies, leaving not a trace of it exposed. Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, Gu Shifeng, and Major Lan Xiaolong. Su Lu looked at the row of people standing at attention in front of him, and understood why the base's commanding officer had sent him, a temporary instructor, to receive them. It was because, of these 17 men, other than Lan Xiaolong, the rest were all members of the 7th Combat Team of the Whitewater Company. The 7th Combat Team of the Security Advisory Department of the Whitewater Company under the jurisdiction of the Nutshell Company has been reorganized. We have been ordered to report to the commanding officer. Please give us further instructions. The fierce combatants stood side by side meticulously. Gunner Xiong Linquan took a step forward and shouted at Su Lu, his voice shaking the mountains. Su Lu was speechless. He did not know if this person was shouting at him because he had stabbed Bai Yulan, or if it was because of his habitual loud voice. Fortunately, he had been a cold and ruthless instructor at the training base for more than 2 months. He had more or less cultivated the cold and fierce aura of a soldier, so he could calmly look at the big face in front of him and did not take a step back. After a moment of silence, he did not understand and said softly, "There are no instructions. Since you're here, let's eat first." Sitting behind the self-propelled green rail car that entered the base, Su Lu took off his sunglasses, narrowed his eyes, and asked with a frown, "What's going on?" The 7th Combat Team was reorganized. Why was it sent to the base? It was a direct order from the Ministry of National Defense. The 7th Combat Team has been reorganized for a long time, but you, the director, have not been here, so they have been idle. The 83-84 Combat Team also picked a group of people to be the peripheral force of the 7th Combat Team. This time, they did not come with you. Now that I think about it, the people you can command are basically a battalion. Major Lan Xiaolong sat beside him. As an officer of the Harbor City Guard District, he had spent some time with Su Lu, so he was comfortable talking to him. He shrugged and said, "In Harbor City, the order I received was to protect you, and now it seems to be the same." Su Lu was silent for a long time. Looking at the silent members in front of the rail car, he pursed his lips and said, "I'm asking why." "It was an order from the Ministry of National Defense, how do we know the reason?" Lan Xiaolong shrugged again and said, "But I can guess a little." Su Lu looked at him with a bitter smile and said, "Hurry up and say it, or the question marks in my head are going to explode. I'm from the 17th Armored Division." White Magnolia. Lan Xiaolong looked at his face and said, "You're also from the 17th Division. Out of the 18 members of the 7th Combat Team, 15 of them are from our division. The 7th Combat Team has always been the strongest in the Whitewater Company." The Ministry of National Defense bypassed the Nutshell Board of Directors and directly ordered the reorganization of the 7th Combat Team. The 83-84 Combat Team was stationed in the Harbor City Guard District. Before the unit's designation was changed, it was the most famous 17th Armored Division of the Federation. Li Pifu was the commander of the 17th Armored Division. Su Lu was silent. How could a combat team of the security company be related to the old man in Philadelphia? "You're training officers in the training base, which is contributing to the Federal Army. You're leading the 7th Combat Team to give you a group of your own subordinates. Lan Xiaolong took a puff of his cigarette, and his expression became serious and serious. The old commander definitely doesn't want to see his old unit turn from an iron-blooded army into a group of riffraff troops. Since he thinks highly of you, this mission naturally has to be given to you. You definitely can't be a commander now, so you can only start practicing with the 7th Combat Team. Su Lu felt that this reasoning was too ridiculous. Li Pifu was the Federation's god of war. Even if he took care of him a little for the sake of his uncle, how could he let him do this kind of thing? You guessed right. Nonsense, if I could know what those big shots are thinking, why would I be a soldier? Wouldn't it be better to just charge into the stock market? Lan Xiaolong said in annoyance. The team members in front of the railcar had been sitting for a while, but now they began to relax. Some of them crossed their legs, some of them began to smoke, and some of them began to talk loudly. Su Lu shook his head and thought about how this major peeked at Shang Qiu's cleavage in the underground base of the Ministry of Engineering. He sighed and said, "No wonder you're from the 83-84 combat team. Same here, you're not a proper soldier either." Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said that in addition to the 30 or so excellent military officers in the training base, there were suddenly 17 more unofficially organized armed personnel. Although according to the Ministry of Defense, these armed personnel were only there to listen, the atmosphere in the base still became a little strange. The three major security companies of the Federation often cooperated with the military in battle, but there was a gap between active duty soldiers and these unofficially organized soldiers. The armed personnel of Team 7 actually had military records in their respective units, but for some reason, when they returned to the unit, they didn't look like professional soldiers at all. They were doing their duty as unofficially organized soldiers. The most important thing was that the officers who received the training had graduated from various universities and belonged to the typical academic faction. However, the 17 men who came later were definitely born in the wilderness. They all started off as small soldiers on the battlefield and relied on killing enemies to get to where they were today. In terms of rank, the trained officers were naturally higher. Other than Lan Xiaolong, none of the members of Team 7 had the nerve to take out their epaulets to dry. In terms of commanding ability and comprehensive assessment of some subjects, the trained officers were also a lot better than the members of Team 7. But when it came to specific combat ability, those 17 men were all looking up, full of disdain and contempt for these academic military nobles. What made Su Lu feel strange was that although the atmosphere in the base was strange and tense, there was no intense conflict between the two sides. After 2 days of observation, even though his butt was vaguely on Team 7's side, he had to admit that it was mainly because those academic soldiers were maintaining their tolerance and did not show the attitude of a superior officer. The attention of the trained officers was all on the upcoming mecha assessment. Most of the other subjects had already been completed, but for this MX mecha assessment, their eyes were already red from waiting. Because of the attitude Su Lu had displayed in the base, the trained officers began to dig up his background. In the end, they finally found out about his relationship with the Minister of Defense's family. Everyone thought they understood why Su Lu was so arrogant. This kind of nepotism was the most unacceptable thing in the military, and their hearts became increasingly conflicted. In the dorms at night, one could often hear some officer coldly saying that he was ready to open a paint factory to teach someone a lesson. A week after the arrival of the 17 men, the MX-MEC's first assessment had ended. Most of the officers who had been trained had demonstrated excellent control and combat abilities in the assessment, reaching the passing standard. The ones with the best results were Hua Xiaoxi from Celine, and Zhou Yu, who had a deep understanding of the MX-MEC. On the rostrum, Su Lu finished reading out the results and sighed softly. Very satisfied with the results of these 2 months of hard work, he removed the sunglasses on his nose and said to the people below the rostrum, "In half an hour, I'll be waiting for you all at the entrance." The conference room was silent. The trained officers stood up silently and walked towards the door. This silence seemed to hide some kind of hostility. Due to the strict military discipline, they could not do anything to the instructor. Today, they finally had a chance to vent their anger openly, but after all, they were all mid-ranking officers and would not make a big fuss like a hooligan. Instead, they all clenched their fists in excitement. Unexpectedly, half an hour later, Sulu did not walk with them into the underground hangar, but instead led them to the field. Accompanied by the dull evening breeze, some of the fallen leaves on the field moved slowly. Wearing sunglasses, Sulu turned his head and said to the officers, "Who is it?" "Me." Hua Xiaoxi from the West Woods Military District stepped forward and glanced calmly at Sulu, his heart brimming with confidence. He had tied for the highest score in this assessment, and from the very beginning, he had been the one to lead his fellow students in resisting Instructor Su's humiliation. Stepping forward now to challenge on behalf of the officers was only natural. Very natural. Sulu nodded and said, "After learning MX for so long, you are the most outstanding student. I think you should know very well what MX's main purpose is." This was the question an instructor asked a student. Hua Xiaoxi thought for a moment and then said without hesitation, "It's to kill using physical techniques. To control MX well, other than familiarizing yourself with the operating system, what is the most important tactical quality a pilot should have? Close-range combat." Sulu unbuttoned the collar of his lieutenant colonel uniform, nodded and said, "You said it very clearly. Then use close-range combat to knock me down, then use mecha. Do you have any objections?" The surrounding officers looked at each other. Although they felt that the instructor's words were slightly different from what they had said at the beginning, these words also made some sense. The key was to use mecha to challenge. With the protection of the safety control system, they could at most make Instructor Su lose some face. Using close-range combat to challenge first was even better. Other than making the instructor lose face, they could also make the instructor's face bruise and vent their anger. As for whether these people would lose or not, they had not considered it. Until today, they still thought that the young instructor Su was a pretty good technical supervisor, an arrogant brat with a great background. If they really fought, how could he be a match for people like them who had been on the battlefield for so long? Without another word, Hua Xiaoxi took off his uniform and began to move the joints of his arms and legs, warming up before the fight. After taking off his clothes, it was discovered that this ace pilot from the West Woods Military District had strong muscles. He was definitely also an expert in close-range combat. The surrounding officers had expressions of schadenfreude on their faces. Now that the test was over, there was naturally no need to maintain absolute courtesy to the instructor. Occasionally, a trace of doubt would flash across the faces of a few people. They felt that there was something wrong with the instructor agreeing to this challenge. However, no one noticed that at the edge of the crowd, two officers were staring at Sulu with cold gazes. They were from the 3rd Military District and had been silent these past few days. Only when the officers found out Su Li's true identity did the coldness in their eyes grow thicker and thicker. The members of Team 7 who were listening in stood far away at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the trees and lying on the stone steps, their figures lazy. They were also very curious about Su Li's strength. Seeing was believing. They wanted to see if their supervisor was as ferocious as Lao Bai had said. Only Zhou Yu laughed bitterly and turned his head away, unwilling to see Hua Xiaoxi's miserable appearance later. "You're the instructor. I won't hit your face." The wind rose on the field. Hua Xiaoxi's face was dark. The moment he attacked, it was the sharpest direct attack of the military special forces. At this time, Su Lu was still wearing his sunglasses. His eyes narrowed under the lenses, and he allowed the fierce wind from the fist to hit him in the face. Only then did his left hand flip up casually, blocking the bend of the opponent's elbow. He took 3 steps forward. The edge of his palm, his fingertips, his wrist, and the hard tip of his elbow sprayed out like raindrops, hitting Hua Xiaoxi's body like a drum. His movements were too fast. It was like countless shadows flashing between the two of them. Hua Xiaoxi barely covered his chest and retreated. He felt a wave of pain and numbness on his body and arm. He couldn't help but turn pale. He didn't know what the instructor's body was made of to be able to reach such a fast speed. Just as everyone was shocked and Hua Xiaoxi was retreating with a grunt, Su Lu suddenly pulled back his fist, raised his right leg, and struck out like a bolt of lightning, hitting the outer side of Hua Xiaoxi's knee. Hua Xiaoxi's strength was all concentrated on the defense of his upper body. His body suddenly lost its balance. Like a scene in a movie, he flipped in the air and then fell tragically onto the hard ground with a muffled thud. Chapter 327. The field was deathly silent. The officers looked at this scene in disbelief. Some of them had thought that Instructor Su's close combat ability would be extremely strong, which was why they had agreed to this kind of challenge. However, they could never have imagined that Hua Xiaoxi, as an expert of the West Woods military district, would not even be able to withstand a single blow from Su Lu. After a series of breezes and drizzles, he was beaten into a stiff stick by Su Lu and fell from the air to the ground. Even if it had been a little longer, the officers would have been able to accept this kind of situation easily. However, they only heard a series of muffled sounds that sounded like raindrops hitting sand. Hua Xiaoxi retreated miserably, and then the instructor kicked. Hua Xiaoxi flew up and fell down. They could see that Instructor Little Su seemed to be using the close combat techniques of the military, but it was extremely different in some aspects, especially the feeling when he attacked. Whether it was extending his elbow, knee, or entering the body, each of his actions was clean and efficient, but also extremely fast. He launched with a flick, retracted with a touch. He did not fully extend, but his speed was displayed to the extreme. This kind of close combat method always made the audience feel that Su Lu was like a girl who did not use his full strength. It was difficult for him to use his full strength, but the effect was exceptionally clear and powerful. The final result was so jaw-dropping. He had knocked down Hua Xiaoxi in a single exchange. This kind of close combat ability was a bit too strong. Looking at Su Lu, who was taking off his sunglasses, the officer's eyes finally began to show some kind of reverence and admiration, and also a bit of coldness. The two officers with cold gazes looked at each other and frowned, as if they felt that this matter was a bit more difficult to handle. Meanwhile, the members of Team 7 at the periphery of the crowd had already stood up from the stone steps by the tree. With complicated gazes, they stared at Su Lu. At this time, they experienced the evaluation that Bai Yulan had once made, and more or less confirmed the fierceness of their future direct superior. Su Lu took off his sunglasses and reached out to pull up Hua Xiaoxi on the ground. Earlier, when he attacked, he did not use even a sliver of the true power in his body. He completely relied on the 10 postures that were soaked into his bones and the battle instincts he had forged over the years. It was not difficult to defeat the opponent, but he did not cause any real damage to the opponent. "If you can beat me one day, you can try using the mecha again," he said with a smile. The thought of not having to get on the mecha to reveal that he was not as strong as Madman Li made him feel very gratified. Hua Xiaoxi propped up his upper body and spat out a mouthful of sand and sand. He hatefully said, "I underestimated the enemy. Otherwise, I would have been able to hold on a little longer." Soldiers were simple and direct. A loss was a loss. Hua Xiaoxi did not plan on persevering. It was just that he kept feeling that he had been knocked out of his head by the instructor's nagging combat skills. Otherwise, he would have been able to persevere for a while longer. However, as soon as he raised his head, he saw Su Li's extremely sincere smile. His words could not help but stop abruptly. At this moment, he suddenly felt that Instructor Little Su's face without the sunglasses was so amiable with a smile, as if he did not look as hateful as before. No one knew that during the 2 months in the training base, Su Lu had been wearing sunglasses on his nose to hide his smiling, amiable, and harmless eyes. In order to play the role of a cold instructor, he could press the corners of his lips into a sheet of frost, but he still could not do anything about this pair of eyes. After Hua Xiaoxi shook his head and returned to the crowd, Su Lu swept his gaze over the officers around him and said with a smile, "Who else?" No one answered. Although some of the officers believed that their close combat abilities were much stronger than Hua Xiaoxi's, when faced with Instructor Su's seemingly chaotic but actually extremely incisive combat skills, they did not have much confidence in winning. More importantly, at this moment, as they looked at Instructor Su's smiling face and thought about their mecha lessons these past few days, their hearts calmed somewhat. Just like Hua Xiaoxi, that urge to vent his anger that had been somewhat childish to begin with gradually faded away. In the midst of the silence, someone suddenly said in a low voice, "Can it be 2v1? Su Le looked over with some confusion. To everyone's surprise, after Su Le had displayed his close combat prowess, the officers who had still stepped forward to issue a challenge were from the 3rd Military Region. They were precisely the two people who had been sizing up Su Le with cold gazes earlier. Perhaps they were very confident in their combat prowess, but strangely, for some reason, they seemed to be constantly looking for a chance to attack Su Le directly. The officers frowned, thinking to themselves that even with their military ranks, they were not real cadets. Challenging a little instructor and losing was already embarrassing enough, what more when it was 2v1. However, when they recognized these two officers, the words they had been about to say turned into ice and snow stuck in their mouths at the same time. The field was silent. The two officers who had stepped forward to issue the challenge had been abnormally quiet and dutiful in the past half-year at the base, but in reality, they were particularly eye-catching because these two belonged to the 3rd Military Region's trump card, the Iron 7th Division. Every time they thought of the federal military's most dazzling, yet coldest, young instructor, no one was willing to provoke them, even if the training officers were all geniuses in the military. Everyone knew how cold and heartless that Instructor Du was, yet he was an extremely protective person. If they were able to fight under this kind of commanding officer, it would undoubtedly be the most exciting and happiest thing. However, becoming enemies with the officers under him was definitely an unwise move. Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed as he quietly watched the two officers walk out from the crowd. Relying on the ability to see through people's hearts that Uncle Feng Yu greatly admired, he could clearly sense the cold and severe intent hidden under these two officers' ordinary faces. Unlike Hua Xiaoxi and the others who challenged him to vent their anger, these two officers clearly had other intentions. One of the officers said coldly, "We are cadets. We want to ask for guidance from Instructor Xiao Su. Please agree." Su Le was slightly taken aback. He used his hand to comb through his slightly messy hair and tossed the sunglasses in his hand to Zhou Yu. Then, when he raised his right hand and was about to say something, he found that he couldn't seem to find any reason to refuse this challenge. "What are your names?" He wasn't clear about the origins of these two officers. "Chang 1, Chang 2. The two officers replied in a low voice at the same time. The instructor gave us code names. From the day we entered the military, until the day we retire, we only have code names. What instructor? The 3rd Military Region's Iron 7th Division. Su Le had never heard of the Iron 7th Division, so he naturally didn't know that the instructor was such an untouchable and powerful figure. He only sank into deep confusion. He had never been to S3 and had even less of an interaction with the 3rd Military Region, so why were these two officers in front of him like fierce tigers filled with killing intent towards him? The two officers stood on the left and right. Suddenly, they took a deep breath, and all the joints on their bodies started to crackle. What was shocking was that their bodies seemed to swell up along with the crackling sounds, and their uniforms were extremely tight. When the surrounding crowd saw this, they subconsciously expanded their area. Including Hua Xiaoxi, all the officers stared at the field with suspicion and vigilance. They knew very well that the two officers who came out to challenge Su Le were ranked at the top of the list for close combat in this assessment, and the 3rd Military Region's Iron 7th Division was also an ace troop that was famous for its close combat ferocity. What kind of level did the Special Forces personally trained by such an instructor have? Not to mention, the current state of the two Iron 7th Division officers meant that they had once learned some kind of technique in the training hall. With these two officers attacking one, would Instructor Xiao Su be able to hold on? Everyone felt a sense of danger pervading the field. Right now, there was no commanding officer or military police present, but presumably these two officers wouldn't dare to make a move. But for some reason, everyone felt that something dangerous was about to happen. The members of the 7th Division on the periphery had already stood up. They were all skilled soldiers in the forest and could faintly smell the scent of blood. In particular, Xiong Linquan's pupils constricted slightly. Thinking of Bai Yulan's instructions on the sickbed, his palm subconsciously moved to the bottom of the stone steps and applied a bit of force. This time, Su Lu was still thinking about where the gloominess and hatred in the eyes of the two officers came from. He lowered his head and was silent, his mind wandering. However, before his mind could calm down, a strong wind rushed toward his face. Chang 1 and Chang 2, these two Iron 7th Division close combat experts, stomped their thick-soled military boots on the solid surface of the field. The ground trembled slightly, and two wisps of light smoke rose into the air. The two of them were like fierce tigers leaping down from a cliff. In an instant, they closed the distance between them and Su Lu and attacked him, who had his head lowered in thought. One of them punched towards Su Li's chin, while the other moved close to his body and raised his knee to attack the base of his thigh. The attack was extremely ruthless, and the wind whistled as it broke through the air. This might have been a sneak attack, and it might have been somewhat shameless, but with the challenge before them, Su Lu acquiesced. These two officers of the Iron 7th Division would always be able to find some excuse afterward. Furthermore, with the arrow on the bow and the fist in front of them, regardless of whether it was the audience or the person involved, they could only watch as this scene unfolded. Su Lu suddenly raised his head, and a trace of anger flashed through his slightly narrowed eyes. His anger wasn't because of the sinister and vicious attacks of the officers, but because he still didn't understand why they hated him. In a flash, his state of mind was as steady as a rock. Just like in the countless dangerous moments in the past, he calmly took a step forward. His body was like a nail nailed to the ground. At the same time, he flipped his left hand and grabbed Chang 1's wrist, who was attacking his chin. His right leg swung to the right and slapped the inside of Chang 2's knee with the outer edge of his thigh. If he had been dealing with an ordinary person, with the reaction speed and skill he displayed at this moment, this would have been a perfect response. According to the usual development of close-range combat, Su Lu would have closed in on his opponent again and used his iron shoulder to push one of them away. At the same time, his left hand would follow the opponent's elbow joint and stab the other person's armpit. One punch would numb the opponent's blood and make him unable to continue fighting. However, what Su Lu did not expect was that although his left hand grabbed Chang 1's wrist, what his fingertips touched was like an old tree root. In particular, the fine muscles on Chang 1's wrist suddenly tightened and jumped horizontally, like the skin of an old tree root bursting. This made his 3 fingers unable to wedge into the other's muscle fibers. And when he leaned violently to the right, it was like leaning against a thick wall. Not only did he not push the other away, but he also exposed his right rib to Chang 2's attack. Su Lu would never underestimate any of his enemies, but he didn't treat these two officers as irreconcilable enemies. He hadn't used a single vicious move, hadn't mobilized a single strand of the violent power in his body, yet in the end, he had lost the initiative. The 2 officers of the Iron 7th Division did not let go of this opportunity. A cold light flashed in their eyes as they attacked Su Li's vital points. With 2 muffled sounds, the 3 people on the field quickly blocked a few times. Like 3 shadows, the shadows turned into concrete bodies in an instant. The situation on the field had changed completely. The 2 officers of the 3rd Military Region had broken through Su Li's defense and used the exact same method to get close to him. They grabbed his wrist with one hand and blocked under his armpit with the other, waiting for the right moment to exert force. This was the most vicious close-range combat technique, the anti-joint technique. If these 2 officers were allowed to unleash their full strength, even if Su Li's shoulder joint was still intact, the cartilage in his elbow would definitely shatter into pieces. The two officers of the Iron 7th Division did not immediately press down on Su Lu. They just maintained this posture, as if they wanted to show the surrounding officers what would happen if Su Lu was defeated. They looked coldly at Su Li's face, who was right in front of them. They were not worried that Su Lu would be able to win because no matter how big the difference in strength between the two sides was, they already had the absolute advantage. Using the simplest lever theory in physics, Su Lu, whose arms were blocked, was unable to exert any force at all. The spectating officers had felt a strange sense of danger when the challenge started. However, when they saw that the two of them had defeated instructor Xiao Su in one fell swoop, they thought that even though the two of them were Iron 7th Master's Ice Men, they still wouldn't dare to hurt an instructor as students. Thus, they heaved a sigh of relief. Only Xiong Lin Quan, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, had the coldness in his eyes getting deeper and deeper. His 5 fingers that were grabbing onto the stone steps behind him started to exert force. His knuckles turned white, and he was actually able to lift the stone steps that weighed dozens of kilograms by an inch. The atmosphere was very silent, very strange, and very awkward. As an instructor, Su Lu was completely controlled by 2 students. Although he was younger than these officers and had no experience in the military, nor did he have a record of killing people, he was still an instructor. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel a little humiliated. Instructor said that strength is strength when speed is multiplied by strength. The limit of an individual's strength is constant. Chang Yi looked at his face that was close by, and his eyes were full of ridicule and indifference. He said in a lecturing tone, "The faster the speed, the lighter the strength of the punch. You're just playing with fancy moves, but we, the people of the Iron 7th Division, are not as weak as those guys." Both of his arms were blocked, and his joints were restrained. Human physiology and basic physics confirmed that Su Lu was completely restrained, so this Iron 7th Division officer was in the mood to appreciate his failure and ridicule his incompetence. "I admit defeat," Su Lu said directly with a smile. He wasn't obsessed with winning or losing. On the contrary, he was obsessed with the opponent's hatred for him, and he really wanted to know how far the Iron 7th Division officer wanted to go. The officer didn't expect Su Lu to admit defeat so easily. After a slight pause, he said fiercely, "I don't accept. You're an instructor. If we kill you, we'll definitely have to go to military court. But I think if we just break your arms, there shouldn't be too much of a problem." His eyes were cold and ruthless. He said in a low voice, "In close combat, there are often accidental injuries like this, right?" The conversation in the field was very low and fast, so the officers in the crowd didn't hear it at all. They wondered why instructor Xiao Su still didn't admit defeat. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then lowered his head and said, "Since it's revenge, let me know the reason. Then I'll feel better, right? Park Ji-ho is someone that the Iron 7th Division wants." Chang Yi said coldly, "I'm from the same yard as him." Su Lu raised his head, an indescribable emotion flashing through his eyes. Almost at the same time, the 2 Iron 7th Division officers' eyes flashed fiercely. Their muscles tightened, and they clamped their arms around his elbow joint, pressing down hard. Not all the people in the crowd were combat experts, but as outstanding officers that the Federation focused on grooming, they definitely had a sharp and accurate eye. When the 2 Iron 7th Division officers lowered their shoulders and crossed their legs, at least half of the people in the crowd could see what they were going to do next. It was just a very common camp challenge. The winner was already decided, but who would have thought that it wasn't over yet? In these past 2 months, the officers had hated MX Mecha class to the core. However, after passing the assessment, they no longer hated instructor Little Su for wearing sunglasses and pretending to be cool. Deeply educated in discipline and self-control, they knew very well that upholding the original challenge agreement today was more of a tradition of steel in the military camp. In some ways, this was just a game between men. But these 2 people from the Iron 7th Division were actually going to break instructor Xiao Su's arm in front of everyone on the field. Could it be that the soldiers raised by Commander Du of the Iron 7th Division were so cold and cruel that they weren't even afraid of the military law? Or could it be that because they had the Iron 7th Division as their backing, they didn't care about the military law at all? In the midst of the shock, Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu's expressions changed drastically, and they immediately started to move. But there was one person who reacted faster than them. Outside the crowd, there was a crisp sound as the stone steps were lifted up by someone. Xiong Linquan roared as he held the heavy concrete steps with both hands. Like a deity, he shook the crowd and rushed over before the other two. He valiantly smashed the stone steps down. With a muffled boom, the heavy concrete steps smashed into the ground, creating a crater. In the blink of an eye, the stone steps, which weighed who knew how many kilograms, were shattered by the huge force. Debris flew everywhere, and dust flew everywhere. However, Xiong Linquan, who had rushed over like a god, spread out his hands and stared blankly at where the stone steps had landed. He blinked in shock, and didn't feel that the web between his thumb and index finger had been split open and was bleeding. There was a suffocating silence in the field, because his thunderous attack missed. 3 meters before the stone steps landed, the three people who were tangled up with each other still maintained their previous postures, as if they hadn't moved at all. The only reason they were able to dodge this terrifying attack was because at the last moment, someone still had the strength to force the other two people to take 3 steps back. There was only one person who could do this. The pupils of the 2 Iron 7th Division officers shrank as they stared at Su Li's face in horror. When they attacked with all their might, they found that Su Li's arm didn't break as they had imagined. It didn't even bend. This completely violated the physiological structure and physics of the human body. Su Li's arm seemed to be cast from iron. Su Li's eyes were unusually bright. He looked at them and said sincerely, "After you get out of the hospital, tell your teacher that his reasoning is bullshit to me. I'm fast enough, and I'm strong enough." His empty left hand viciously stabbed at Su Li's eyes. In the beginning, these 2 Iron 7th Division officers only wanted to humiliate Su Li by breaking his arms during combat training. Once he realized that something was amiss, Chang Won became bold. He did not care about Su Li's identity as an instructor and used an absolutely forbidden move. This included the punch that had been aimed at the corner of Su Li's eyes, as well as the current kick and stab. No matter which action it was, it could have taken Su Li's life or left him with irreparable damage. Looking at the 2 fingers that were getting closer and closer to his eyes, Su Li's eyes suddenly brightened. A hint of viciousness flashed through his eyes. He retracted his left hand as fast as lightning and then struck out horizontally. Back in Linyuan, Madman Li had thrown 3 horizontal punches, but Su Li had taken all 3 of them head-on. Today, Su Li was also using this kind of unreasonable horizontal punch. He did not care about the fingers in front of him or the military boots that were about to reach his lower abdomen. He threw out a brutal and terrifying punch. Absolute strength and speed were like the occasional torrent of rays that wreaked havoc among the stars. No matter what kind of intricate techniques or insidious responses the opponent had, they would all be blown into disarray by this kind of absolute realm. It was an indescribable tragedy. Amidst the tearing sounds, the sleeve of Su Li's military uniform on his forearm was torn into pieces by the force of the pulsating force. The 2 fingers that were thrusting towards Su Li's eyes like a viper first met the horizontal punch. As expected, the knuckles shattered with a crisp sound. Chang Yi's eyes were full of fear. He did not pay attention to the intense pain in his left hand. With a roar, he pulled back his right arm to block his cheek before the fierce fist could reach his face. However, if Su Li could block Madman Li's horizontal punch, how could this officer of the Iron 7th Division be able to block it? With a loud boom, Su Li's horizontal punch struck the other's vertical arm. Chang Won's body trembled violently as he stumbled back 7 steps. However, in the end, he was unable to withstand the powerful torrent of energy and fell to the ground in a tragic manner. He rolled backwards like a rolling gourd, rolling all the way until he was out of the crowd of dumbfounded onlookers. After rolling for more than 20 meters, he finally stopped. His limbs went limp as he lay on the ground and fainted. How much strength was needed to send someone more than 20 meters away with one punch? There was a deathly silence. Xiong Lin Quan, who was still bleeding from the web between his thumb and index finger, looked at Su Lu in disbelief. He felt an unprecedented chill in his heart. He thought that not only was Lao Bai right, but he also seemed to have underestimated Supervisor Su's strength. Su Lu pulled back his fist and looked down. He wiped the traces of blood from his fingertips on his military uniform and walked toward Chang Yi, who was outside the crowd. Chang Er was at his feet. His thigh was at least fractured, but his life was not in danger, so he did not need to worry. Seeing instructor Xiao Su walk toward the unconscious Chang Yi, the military cadets had shocked and complicated expressions. They did not know if instructor Xiao Su had been angered by these two officers of the Iron 7th Division and was not willing to give up. He wanted to beat them to death. Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu looked at each other and forcibly suppressed the shock in their hearts. They walked to Su Li's side and whispered a few words. Su Lu shook his head and walked to Chang Yi's side. Looking at the unconscious officer, he said, "Call the medical team over." Chang Yi, who was unconscious on the field, had 2 fingers on his left hand that were completely shattered. Placed beside him, they looked as ugly as the chicken claws sold in the black market. What was even more frightening was that the upper arm that he used to protect his face was already fractured, and the power contained in Su Li's punch had passed through his arm bone and caused his lower jaw to be slightly deformed. A few broken teeth flew out with blood. It was truly a tragic sight to behold. This triggered Su Li's ruthless state of mind. Even though he had tried his best to protect his face, it was a pity that his face, which could not be considered handsome, could not be preserved. Fortunately, the medical and logistical support in the training base was very strong, so he probably would not die just like that. The fight on the field naturally caused a huge uproar in the training base. The 2 officers, who had passed all the examinations and were about to participate in the graduation drill, had been beaten by their instructors in school. One of them had a fractured thigh bone, while the other was seriously injured and unconscious. No matter what, this was a major incident that required investigation. The National Defense Department authorized the base to conduct an independent investigation. The base's investigation naturally would not pay attention to the fight between Instructor Su and Hua Xiaoxi. Instead, the focus of the investigation was placed on the latter. Su Lu was not worried about the results of the investigation because it was the officers who had initiated the challenge. Furthermore, he strictly abided by his duties as an instructor. He had never thought of returning a heavy blow. Even though the other party had disregarded the difference in military ranks, fought 2 against 1, and even tried to seriously injure him after gaining the upper hand. During the entire process of the fight, it was not until the officer named Chang Yi used lethal and ruthless attacks again and again that the ruthlessness in his heart surged to teach the other party a lesson. He firmly believed that he was in the right. The results of the follow-up investigation also proved this point. There were a total of 50 people on the field who had witnessed the entire process with their own eyes. Even if the 17 people of Team 7 were not included, there were still many officers who testified to the base's investigation team. Instructor Su had not done anything wrong in this matter. He had only been forcefully dragged into danger by the other party, so he had no choice but to use a heavy blow to protect himself. The officers had always held great opinions and contempt for Su Lu. However, at this time, the contempt had disappeared without a trace with the abilities Su Lu displayed. They were the most outstanding officers in the Federation. Naturally, they were not willing to violate military discipline in order to punish Su Lu. Moreover, soldiers had their own personal integrity. However, other than 5 officers who maintained their silence, everyone else stood on Su Li's side in the investigation. One day later, the two injured officers of the Iron 7th Division left the base and were sent by military aircraft to the Army General Hospital for treatment. The results of the base's investigation were not conclusive. Su-lu was called by the base's commanding officer to have a talk. He was not reprimanded. What puzzled him was that the two officers who had caused trouble were not disciplined either. Because they were selected by the Iron 7th Division, even the base did not want to cause any more trouble and reported the disciplinary action. Su-lu sat at the innermost table in the cafeteria with a thermal lunch box in his hand. He couldn't help but frown as he thought about the news he had heard from the Zhou family. After this incident, he called Zhou Yu and asked her to help investigate the relationship between Park Ji-ho and the Iron 7th Division. During the fight, the officer of the Iron 7th Division, Chang Yi, thought that he was going to win and coldly said that they were going to avenge Park Ji-ho. Thinking about this, Su-lu became a little vigilant. He often thought about the hatred the Park family had for him in the District Procurator General's office. Especially when he remembered the saliva of Park Ji-ho's younger sister and the frosty words of Park Ji-ho's widow in the car. He knew that the hatred of murder would never disappear. He couldn't rest assured until he figured out the true relationship between the Iron 7th Division and Park Ji-ho. Zhou Yu was the daughter of the Minister of National Defense. Under the personal guidance of Lady Tai, she had traveled extensively in the past few years. It was easy for her to investigate this matter. In just one night, she called back. It turned out that the Park family had been living in S3. Park Ji-ho's father used to be a logistics officer in the Iron 7th Division. After he retired from the military, the whole family moved to S1. When Park Ji-ho was young, he had lived in the Iron 7th Division's compound and had a good relationship with the people in the division. More importantly, Park Ji-ho had entered the 2nd Military Academy under the name of the Iron 7th Division. His performance in the academy was excellent. As long as he completed the National Defense Department's all-rounder training program, he would definitely return to the Iron 7th Division after a year of training in the Nutshell Company. In a sense, the Park Ji-ho that Su-lu killed at the entrance of Husan Road was the Iron 7th Division's main training target. Zhou Yu warned Su-lu on the phone that he should keep a safe distance from the Iron 7th Division in the future. This was because the trump card division of the 3rd Military Region was famous for being very protective of their own people. Su-lu didn't understand. His backer in the Federation was really powerful. Could it be that there was really someone in the federal military who was willing to cause trouble for him? Zhou Yu didn't explain too much on the phone. After all calls in and out of the base were monitored, so there were many things that couldn't be explained. She just seriously reminded Su-lu that the Iron 7th Division was a special force in the federal military. It was very strong, and the commander of this division, Commander Du, wasn't someone to be trifled with. If they really got into a fight, even her father wouldn't be able to say anything. Iron 7th Division. Su-lu shook his head with a bitter smile. Killing Park Ji-ho wasn't something that he planned. It was the other party's plot to harm him, and they ran into his knife. The knife flashed at the entrance of Husan Road. Park Ji-ho was dead, and he was still alive. In the eyes of the Park family and the Iron 7th Division, he was probably a shameless murderer who used the Tai family to escape justice, and Park Ji-ho was an innocent military officer who died at a young age. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little dignified and unhappy. He didn't feel guilty about killing Park Ji-ho, but he also didn't really want to provoke the Iron 7th Division. Even if Zhou Yu didn't warn him, he would have stayed away from the Iron 7th Division in the future. All the courses of the training plan had been completed, and there was going to be a small-scale tactical exercise the day after tomorrow. The instructors from the Federation had already left the base. Only Su-lu hadn't received any further orders from the Ministry of Defense, so he had to stay at the base for the time being. Tonight was the base's banquet. More than 30 military officers were talking loudly in the cafeteria. They were gobbling down food, drinking wine, and hugging each other's shoulders. They were very enthusiastic. After more than half a year of training, these military officers had developed a lot of feelings for each other. They used to be comrades, but now there was a sense of camaraderie. They all knew that they were going to be sent to the front line in the West Woods soon. After today's departure, they didn't know when they would see each other again. Perhaps they would never see each other again. Naturally, there was a lot of emotion and reluctance. Tonight in the cafeteria, who knew how many military regulations had been violated? However, the base understood the emotions of these military officers, especially when they knew that these people would become high-ranking military officers after they left. They didn't want to cross the line, so they acquiesced to their nonsense. As they drank and drank, even Team 7, who had been watching from the sidelines at the beginning, was pulled into the drinking competition by these military officers. In the words of the military officers, although you guys are a little rough, you're really good at fighting. You guys haven't been classmates for a long time, but in the future, if you want to join my army, I'll definitely welcome you with open arms. No one paid any attention to Sulu, who was sitting in the deepest corner. Sulu didn't care either. For him, his 2+ months of life at the training base was just a promise he made to President Pabre and the Ministry of Defense. Or rather, it should be said that it was a job. He ate by himself with the lunchbox in his hand. At this moment, Lan Xiaolong came over with 2 plates of food and 2 wine glasses. He said with a smile, "It's so lively over there. Why are you pretending to be lonely here?" Sulu smiled and said, "I like liveliness, but it seems that liveliness has never liked me." Lan Xiaolong thought for a moment and asked, "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about that Iron 7th Division." Sulu was silent for a moment and said, "I've offended this teacher too much this time. I'll have to stay away from him in the future." Lan Xiaolong poured him a glass of wine and said, "Let me tell you a piece of bad news. At the graduation ceremony the day after tomorrow, the headquarters of these military officers will send people to pick them up. The Iron 7th Division will also send people." Sulu narrowed his eyes. The Ministry of Defense values this training very much. Lan Xiaolong looked at the wine glass and said with slight worry, "The Iron 7th Division will send people to pick them up. It's the teacher, Du Changqing." Su Li's eyes were smiling like 2 crescent moons. Their gazes met, and there was an indescribable tacit understanding. Lan Xiaolong smiled as he poured wine for Su Lu. His cup was never empty. After a round of toasting, the 2 bottles of strong wine he had brought over had long been finished. The crowd around the table gradually dispersed. Lan Xiaolong looked at the gradually intoxicated Su Lu and couldn't help but sigh in praise. Wine doesn't make one drunk, but one gets drunk. The friendship between teacher and student, the relationship between teacher and student, you've taught so many future cornerstones of the Federation. In the future, on the battlefield, just how abundant of a capital will this be? It was unknown what kind of emotion it was, but it made Sulu feel that the cafeteria was filled with a solemn and warm feeling. He drank close to 2 jin of strong wine, and his drunkenness had long entered his brain. He narrowed his eyes and looked at those officers who were at the peak of their lives. He thought that perhaps in a few more days, they would follow their respective troops to the front lines. In the battle against the Empire's invaders, they would spill their hot blood in exchange for the peace of the Federation's people. These faces, whether fat or thin, beautiful or ugly, perhaps would never be seen again in the future. With this thought, hot blood poured into his chest. If it were someone else, perhaps at this moment, they would have slammed the table, stood up, and gathered the officers in front of them. They would loudly and powerfully speak about youth, hot-bloodedness, and sacrifice. However, Su Lu was just Su Lu. He couldn't do this kind of thing. He remained silent as usual. He narrowed his eyes and looked at those officers. He put the bottle to his mouth and drank the remaining wine in the bottle in one gulp. His chest wasn't carefree, but at least it was somewhat satisfying. However, there were still 5 officers in the cafeteria. They sat silently at their small tables. They didn't take advantage of the alcohol to play with those officers, pour out their hearts, or curse the Empire's dogs. Instead, they coldly watched all of this. Lan Xiaolong stared in that direction. He moved close to Su Li's ear and said softly, "The 5 officers who didn't toast are all from the Iron 7th Division." The officers from the Iron 7th Division naturally wouldn't toast to Su Lu. However, whether it was because of the Iron 7th Division's strict discipline or some other reason, the 5 officers at the table didn't even pay attention to the other officers. It was a bit strange in the cafeteria. What shocked Su Lu wasn't this strange atmosphere, but Lan Xiaolong's reminder. He originally thought that the Iron 7th Division only sent 2 officers to the base for training. At this time, he had already beaten them to the Army General Hospital. He didn't expect that there were actually 5 officers from the Iron 7th Division in the base. The Federation specially organized an anti-terrorism exercise and carefully selected 30 officers to participate in this secret training. It was hoped that these people would be able to independently support a side of the war in the future. However, just the Iron 7th Division alone took up 7 of the spots. How many divisions were there in the federal military? The Iron 7th Division alone took up 1/5 of the quota. Su Li's heart was filled with endless shock. What kind of division was this? How strong was the training level and military quality of this division to be able to achieve such shocking results? To be able to train such a division. What kind of person was Du Shaoqing? Thinking about the matter between himself and the Iron 7th Division, and how he had just destroyed 2 officers from the Iron 7th Division who had limitless futures, Su Li's drunkenness actually subsided a little. The glory of the Iron 7th Division spread throughout the universe until the god of war, Li Bofu, left his division. Only then did the 1st Military Region 17th Armored Division completely overwhelm the Iron 7th Division, establishing its position as the Federation's #1 division. The once glorious Iron 7th Division, due to certain reasons, gradually disappeared from the Federation's people's memories. Why is that? Su Lu held the beer bottle tightly and listened to Lan Xiaolong's narration seriously. His mood fluctuated along with the bloody history of the Iron 7th Division. His vigilance and resistance toward the name Iron 7th Division gradually turned into a trace of disappointment. There are many theories, most of which are related to the evaluation of Battle 5460. Many big shots in the military have always had doubts about the process of that battle. Later, due to the pressure of public opinion, they rebuilt the division, but they didn't want to pay attention to it anymore. It seems to be a scar on our history. Lan Xiaolong said faintly, "Those big shots are long dead. No one knows the truth of history." However, just as the Iron 7th Division was stationed in S3 for decades and was so lonely that only the name of the Iron 7th Division remained, Du Shaoqing, who had graduated from the 1st Academy, came to this forgotten corner. The story of the Iron 7th Division began once again. No one knew if there would be a division that could do this in the future, but in the past tens of thousands of years of history, there had never been a division that had been able to win like the Iron 7th Division for 8 years. The 3rd Military Region, which did not have a very high position in the federal military, no longer cared about the questionable Battle 5460 and the bad impression that the military had of the 7th Mechanic Division. Based on the achievements of the Iron 7th Division, the 3rd Military Region did not hesitate to treat the 7th Mechanic Division as their trump card. Whether it was equipment or honor, the 7th Mechanic Division gave them everything they had. During these continuous maneuvers, the 7th Mechanic Division truly gained the reputation of the Iron 7th Division. Du Shaoqing also rose from a battalion commander to a regiment commander. Finally, at the age of 33, he became the youngest division commander in the history of the Federation. He even broke Li Pifu's record. No one had any doubts about this. Although the Iron 7th Division had never shown its sharp fangs at the front line of the West Woods to this day and had never obtained any real military exploits. But when the Iron 7th Division was mentioned, the trump card troops of the various military regions who had encountered the division in maneuvers would think of the Iron 7th Division in the mountains and on the mineral planets. It was as condensed as a fist, scattered like a gust of wind, roaring and howling. It was an iron-blooded division with a cold steel will in its strict and solemn demeanor. These trump card troops were really frightened by the Iron 7th Division in many maneuvers. They absolutely believed that if a division like the Iron 7th Division was sent to the front line, it would be easy for them to achieve their own great military exploits. And Du Shaoqing, who had personally trained this kind of division, of course, he was qualified, and only he was qualified to be the commander of such a division. Su Lu held his empty wine glass and narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. He thought about how Du Shaoqing was able to turn a division that had been deliberately abandoned by the military into a well-disciplined and terrifyingly well-trained Iron 7th Division. He led this division to achieve such a fierce military exploits. He was really not an ordinary person. He could really be said to be extremely talented and had extraordinary perseverance. Or maybe he was just like Li Pifu, a peerless military genius. If he was remembered by such a person, it would not be very good news. When Lan Xiaolong was telling these stories, a few people were sitting around the table. The combat personnel of Iron 7th Division did not toast to Su Lu. Instead, they brought their lunch boxes to the table, which seemed to indicate some kind of attitude. Xiong Linquan frowned and looked at Su Lu. He suddenly said, "I know that the Iron 7th Division is very fierce, but Du Shaoqing is just one person. He wants to become the second army god. He doesn't even know if the Empire will agree. If he really has the ability, he should take the initiative to go fight a few battles in the West Woods." Over the past year, the seniors of Iron 7th Division had heard a lot about Su Li's achievements from Bai Yulan. They found it hard to believe, but after seeing it with their own eyes in the training base, it had a certain impact on their minds. They knew very well that in the years to come, Su Lu would always be the supervisor of Iron 7th Division. They would be Su Li's men. Although they still could not say that they were very close to Su Lu right now, when they saw him worrying about the Iron 7th Division, they subconsciously mocked him a little. After all, in front of outsiders, they had always been on Su Li's side. The Iron 7th Division had been dazzling and imposing in the military all these years because of a series of achievements. However, they did not have a reputation in the Federation. It was precisely because of this that the Iron 7th Division's biggest problem was that they had never been to the front lines in the West Woods. Therefore, Xiong Linquan's question was tantamount to directly asking a question about the Iron 7th Division's most vital part. The soldiers of the Federation valued honor above all else. The 5 officers of the Iron 7th Division who had been silently eating in the distance heard Xiong Linquan's question. A hint of anger flashed across their cold faces. One of the officers suddenly stood up and angrily rebuked Su Li's table. "My division commander has written a letter in blood requesting to fight 103 times. Who dares to say that my division doesn't dare to fight?" Hearing this powerful and resonant sentence, the people at Su Li's table fell silent. Xiong Linquan opened his mouth, but in the end, he did not retort. After all, this involved the most important issue of a division's reputation. Instead, it was Lan Xiaolong who said with a smile, "Don't tell me that the soldiers under Division Commander Du are all like your 2 colleagues who were carried away. From the looks of it, Division Commander Du is just so. The officer who had stood up to debate for the Iron 7 Division had a frosty expression on his face as he said in a cold voice, "Division Commander Shaoqing graduated first from the 1st Affiliated High School of the capital 1st Affiliated High School, entered the 1st Military Academy first, and graduated first from the 1st Military Academy first, a member of the Federation's Trinity Association, the youngest division commander in the Federation. If this is all there is to it, then who can bring it out to compare?" This officer's voice was very cold, but there was a hint of fanaticism in it. The indifference was directed at Su Li's table, but the fanaticism showed the admiration and reverence that the Iron 7th Division officers had for this division commander. The best high school in the Federation was the Capital University affiliated high school, and the most difficult school to get into was the First Military Academy. The Federation had a population of more than 10 billion, and these two most prestigious schools had gathered countless geniuses and elites. Previously, when this officer repeated Du Shaoqing's resume, this division commander had actually gotten first place 3 times in a row. According to the simple life before the catastrophe depicted in the movies, this kind of excellent result was equivalent to getting first place in the 3 examinations, which was extremely rare. The Trinity Association's history was exactly like this. Until today, there were only a dozen members of the Federation's Trinity Association, and most of them were already old men. It was no wonder that when this officer talked about his teacher, his back was ramrod straight and his face was full of pride. Hearing this, Su Li's table was shocked into silence, thinking that Du Shaoqing's resume was really a mess. Even Lan Xiaolong's lips curled into a cold smile, but he didn't say anything, because he really couldn't find a loophole to attack this impeccable division commander. Su Lu was also shocked, but what surprised him was the Iron 7th Division officers' fanatical reverence and worship for their division commander. Based on his rough understanding, he always felt that this kind of situation in the military wasn't a good thing. The Iron 7th Division officers' eyes were as cold as ice, but this kind of calm that was about to freeze represented their pride and glory. Although they didn't show any contempt or disdain, they made the people standing opposite them feel a sense of pressure and displeasure. Su Lu had drunk a lot tonight, so he was a little excited. Feeling the coldness and disdain of the Iron 7th Division officers, he shook his head and said, "I happen to know 2 people who are qualified to enter the Trinity Association. One of them is now a secretary, and the other one is in prison." He smiled, looked up at the officer, and said, "So this doesn't mean anything. I think your division commander Du doesn't want you to talk about his childhood every day." The officer's expression stiffened, and when he was about to say something, Su Lu said seriously, "If you don't believe me, you can ask around and see if I'm lying." The 2 people he was talking about were Secretary Shunli and Shi Qinghai from the back mountain of Macho. One was the person in charge of the Tai family, and the other was the person who had manipulated the presidential election and assassinated Macklin. It was not a disgrace to Du Shaoqing's status as a teacher. However, he only said that one was a secretary, and the other was in prison. This made the people of the Iron 7 Division very angry. The 5 Iron 7th Division officers realized that Instructor Su didn't seem to be lying. After a moment of silence, they saluted and left the busy cafeteria. Su Lu looked at the 5 officers, who didn't fit in with the surrounding environment, and couldn't help but frown. Lan Xiaolong asked, "Is what you said true?" Su Lu paused for a moment before he realized that he was asking about Secretary Shen and Mr. Shi. He smiled and said, "Of course it's true. I rarely lie." Chapter 331. There are many theories. Some say that the Iron 7th Division's performance is too strong. Coincidentally, the situation between the Federation and the Empire has been relatively calm in the past 10 years. If they were to use the 3rd Military Region's Trump Card Division to fight in the West Woods, it would seem that they value the Empire too much. It was already late at night. The early autumn breeze blew on Su Li's hot cheeks, waking him up a little. After getting drunk in the cafeteria, Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu forcefully dragged him out and were now walking towards the instructor's apartment. Lan Xiaolong shrugged, but this habitual action almost made Su Lu vomit. He heard the major of the 83-84 mocking, Trump Card Division. The war god set the strategy of fighting in the West Woods years ago in order to maintain the combat effectiveness of the army in a relatively calm environment. The Trump Card Divisions of the 4 military regions, the Iron Army, which one of them isn't yelling and rushing to the West Woods? Why don't I see the Department of Defense keeping them as a last resort? I don't agree with you. The Iron 7th Division's performance in the various military exercises is indeed too strong. When I was in school, the instructors once discussed this issue. The Federation believes that good steel should be used on warship rams. Iron-blooded troops like the Iron 7th Division have always been suppressing their pride and anger, not allowing them to be deployed, just so that they can be the vanguard of an expedition against the Empire in the future. Zhou Yu said. He had graduated from the first military academy, so the discussion of those professors and lecturers made some sense. Even if what you said makes sense, even though I don't like the Iron 7th Division, I still have to admit their combat effectiveness. Lan Xiaolong's expression was a little lonely. We don't know why the Federation didn't allow them to fight in the West Woods. Su Lu let out a drunken burp. He was too lazy to speak, but when he heard the words that entered his ears, he couldn't help but feel a bit curious. From the attitude of the officers in the training base, the soldiers of the Federation respected and distanced themselves from the Iron 7 Division. The feelings of admiration and discomfort were tangled together, but very few people were like Lan Xiaolong and Xiong Linquan earlier, directly expressing their dissatisfaction. Lan Xiaolong changed the topic and said mockingly, regarding the issue we discussed, there's always a rumor going around. Why the Federation didn't allow the Iron 7th Division to go to the West Woods? What rumor? Commander Zhong of the West Woods Military District. Lan Xiaolong smiled mysteriously and said, he used to be a classmate of Du Shaoqing, but I heard that Commander Zhong hated this person so much that he directly flipped out to the Ministry of Defense and firmly refused to allow the Iron 7th Division to fight in the West Woods. When Su Lu and Zhou Yu heard this for the first time, they couldn't help but be shocked. They thought to themselves, how could a great general of the Federation directly go against the orders of the Ministry of Defense just because of some personal feelings? But after thinking about it silently, it seemed that only this kind of seemingly unreliable rumor could explain why Du Shaoqing couldn't find any opportunity to set foot in the West Woods even though he had been outstanding for more than 10 years. The Zhong family of the West Woods was the only one of the 7 major families of the Federation that had military power. The current head of the family was Little Watermelon's father, Commander Zhong of the West Woods Military District. There were 4 major military academies and 4 major military districts in the Federation. Su Lu also dreamed of a head of purple hair, a pair of black-rimmed glasses, and a certain young genius girl with big breasts. In his dream, there was also a very faint beautiful face, but he couldn't remember who it was. He also dreamed of an old butler wearing a black suit. During his time in the black prison of Fox Fort, he often saw this old butler. Although he could clearly recognize that the other party was the incarnation of some great existence in his dreams, he was already fearless. He walked over with a smile on his face. However, this old thing was somewhat abnormal today. His face was so solemn that it made one's heart palpitate. It seemed that in the next moment, he would turn into countless rays of white light that would envelop Su Li's body and slowly devour it like some single-celled organism, leaving not a single bone behind. Su Lu was very frightened in his dream because he knew that he didn't have many methods to resist the other party. However, he forcefully concealed his fear and forced a smile. He extended his non-existent hands to touch the old butler's wrinkled face. At this moment, the old butler's frosty face finally disappeared. He became like a mischievous child. Using his pair of eyes full of wisdom and absolute calmness, he showed Su Lu what the taste of a shrewd and ruthless craftiness was like. In the end, the old butler's face became as white as a sheet of paper, as white as a snowy mountain. However, he wore the military uniform of a major general. His figure was as straight as a cedar tree in the mountains, emitting a bone-piercing chill. Su Lu woke up and quietly looked at the sky outside the window. He wasn't sure if this dream was auspicious or inauspicious. He didn't know if the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamations underground would always silently watch him like this. However, he knew very well what the officer who appeared in the end represented. It represented the big trouble he was about to encounter soon. That teacher named Du Shaoqing. However, He was fearless. After experiencing so many trials and storms, it would probably be difficult for even the most outstanding figure in the Federation to disturb his state of mind. After washing up, he began to call the relevant departments of the Federation government. He called Zhou Yu and that Madame Zhong. He was in the training base. He was worried about his two friends. Other than calling, it seemed like he couldn't do anything else. Time passed quickly as the radio waves flowed through the phone. In the blink of an eye, it was the day of the graduation ceremony at the training base. The Federation government attached great importance to the military officer training this time. In order to evaluate the results, they specially arranged a temporary military exercise. They transferred 3 fully mechanized divisions and handed them to the military officer students who were about to graduate. This allowed them to demonstrate their combat ability in all aspects. On this day, there were specks of yellow in the lush mountains behind them. With the feeling of autumn, they welcomed countless important figures and Federation soldiers who had come from afar. All kinds of military spaceships and planes arrived with a roar. Accompanied by a dense group of combat helicopters, they landed on a special airport. For a moment, military flags fluttered, military songs resonated, and the sound of footsteps rang out. Countless military officers from the departments directly under the Ministry of Defense and various military regions came to watch the ceremony. Su Lu and the members of Team 7 stood in the shade to the side of the rostrum. Looking at the high-ranking military officers on the rostrum, they were surprised to see a lieutenant general and several major generals. The military exercise officially began. The holographic screen on the rostrum, with the help of the Bureau of Proclamation, accurately displayed the situation of the military exercise in the mountains and the fields. The purpose of this military exercise was to show the results of the training, so the higher-ups of the federal military were not nervous. They even took advantage of the time when the military exercise was advancing to the designated area to receive all the military officers who participated in the training. Su Lu was naturally among those who were received. What made Team 7 and the rest of the military officers extremely shocked was that the lieutenant general on the rostrum, who was also the deputy commander of the 1st Military Region, was incomparably friendly when he personally received Su Lu. Even the major generals behind him were sincerely encouraging him with warm words. Su Lu himself knew the reason, so he could naturally guard his heart and not show a trace of arrogance. In fact, he had nothing to be proud of. What made him vigilant was that except for Lieutenant General Yi, the other high-ranking military officers looked at him with admiration in their eyes. There was also a trace of extremely complicated and strange emotions. The military god left Philadelphia for the first time in order to enter the military prison of Qingcheng to see this young man. This matter was not a secret among the higher-ups of the federal military, and the military officers on the rostrum were all very clear about this. They knew that Su Lu was a person with a strong backer, but they also knew that there was some trouble between him and the Iron 7th Division. They were all very curious about what would happen when Su Lu and teacher Du Shaoqing, who was as cold as ice, met at the graduation ceremony. Su Lu received the order of commendation from the military officers and returned to the team under the shade of the trees. Lan Xiaolong, who had been standing behind him, said softly, Du Shaoqing is here, but he has never liked to show his face in public. Today, he is mainly here to pick up his own soldiers. I will tell you when I recognize them. Su Lu shook his head, put his hands behind his back, and quietly watched the situation on the holographic screen. His smiling face was extremely calm, but his heart began to become vigilant because he felt a pair of emotionless eyes looking at him. Behind the rostrum, a major general slowly retracted his gaze and stood indifferently with his hands behind his back. Stars shone on the shoulders of his well-ironed military uniform. This person wore a pair of black leather gloves and polished military boots. His posture was extremely tall and straight, and his standing posture did not deviate an inch. The details were impeccable. However, whether it was the stars on his shoulder or the reflection of his gloves and military boots, nothing could hide the brilliance of this person's body. This middle-aged general's eyebrows were like unsheathed swords, but they were slightly covered by the shadow of the standard military cap. His whole body exuded a sense of perseverance and calmness, not like an iceberg, but like a cedar tree on an iceberg. In this noisy drill ground, there was a great sense of transcendence. Such a person was naturally Du Shaoqing. Chapter 332. Du Shaoqing, the youngest commander in the history of the Federation, the famous general of a generation who had infinite expectations placed on him by the military, stood meticulously in an inconspicuous corner of the rostrum, but he attracted the attention of most people. Since ancient times, all famous generals had fought bravely on the battlefield. Without mountains of bones, fireworks like death rays, and without actual battle achievements, who could be called a famous general? However, Du Shaoqing successfully overturned this rule. In the past 10 years, Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had never set foot on the front lines of the West Woods. However, in countless military exercises, Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had perfectly demonstrated their powerful combat ability and commanding wisdom, vividly displaying their unique and fierce characteristics. The strategic advisors of the federal military and the major military academies, on the other hand, highly praised his military command theories. They acknowledged that he was the first general in the military who could perfectly combine macro-strategic intentions with specific tactical deductions after the military god Li Bufu. Du Shaoqing, who had never failed in his military career, and whose art of commanding had been written into the teaching materials of the military academy, was certainly a famous general of a generation. Unfortunately, the biggest flaw of being a famous general was that he didn't have the opportunity to be stained with the blood of the people of the Imperium and the dust of the West Woods. This was definitely the biggest regret of Du Shaoqing's life, and also his goal. However, there was still a lot of time left for him. If the war between the Federation and the Imperium broke out again, the Iron 7 Division would have to be on the front lines one day. But right now, he could only wear the hat of a military genius and wear the title of a famous general, stay in the capital ring a little lonely and angry, and participate in these meaningless military exercises and graduation ceremonies. The coldness emitted by the well-ironed military uniform and shiny military boots was probably a true portrayal of this commander's inner feelings. Glancing at Du Shaoqing from the corner of his eyes, Su Li's eyes quickly blinked. Such a peerless figure was like a tiger locked in a laboratory, unable to roar and run in the forest. After a long period of depression, it was likely that he would become even more dangerous. At this time, Lan Xiaolong also saw Du Shaoqing on the stage. The veins on his forehead bulged and then disappeared. He said in a cold tone, "Do you know why this military genius is not willing to be promoted to the 3 military regions and not willing to go to the Ministry of National Defense? That's because he wants to lead the Iron 7th Division to the West Woods, or even to the Empire. He wants to be a commander and lead the Iron 7th Division to the West Woods, or even to the Empire. He wants to make a name for himself. Otherwise, everyone will flatter him and say that he's a famous general. The best place for the general to return to should be on a burning warship." Su Lu looked at the major general on the stage, who was like a cedar tree, and thought for a while. He then slowly said a Federation proverb, "It's not strange that he has this kind of stubbornness. That's because the god of war was fought by our division's commander. When this commander Du first joined the army, every step he took seemed to be following the steps of his old commander. He copied his old commander completely." Lan Xiaolong said coldly and mockingly, "In fact, a lot of people have already seen that Du Shaoqing wants to be the second god of war of the Federation. A soldier who didn't want to be a general wasn't a good soldier, and a general who didn't want to be a god of war probably wouldn't have a bright future." Su Lu had heard too much about the achievements of the Iron 7 Division in the past few days. He knew that Du Shaoqing was a person with amazing talent and a strong will. If he hadn't been suppressed by the big shot of the Zhong family in the West Woods, he probably would have already made outstanding military achievements. It wouldn't be impossible for him to catch up with the old man in Philadelphia. Lan Xiaolong was silent for a while, and then suddenly said with a hint of sadness, "I was in the 17th Division when I joined the army. Back then, when the commander sealed up the marshal's uniform, the 17th Division accepted the military order to become a regular ground force and was transferred to the Hongdu Garrison District. The designation was changed to 83-84. Before the designation was changed, the Federation held a joint military exercise. In fact, it was just to send off the 17th Division. During the exercise, all the brother units gave us face. At that time, our division was filled with sadness, so we didn't do much. Only the Iron 7 Division of the 3rd Military Region looked like they had taken an aphrodisiac when they saw our division. Their faces were dark, and they chased after us like ghosts." What happened in the end? It was the first time that Su Lu knew about this. He turned around and asked in surprise. "Our division lost." Lan Xiaolong lowered his head slightly and said in a heavy tone, "The 17th Division has always been the first division of the Federation. It was an undefeated division that was personally created by the old man. Even in the territory of the Empire, it had never tasted defeat, let alone a mere military exercise. But, in the last military exercise before the designation was changed, we lost. We lost to the Iron 7 Division of the 3rd Military Region. At that time, Du Shaoqing wasn't the commander of the Iron 7 Division. He was the military officer in charge of tactical deduction in his division." Lan Xiaolong raised his head and stared at Du Shaoqing and the officers of the Iron 7 Division in the distance with disgust. He said coldly, "In order to build up his reputation, he took advantage of the fact that our division's morale was still unstable to beat us at the 17th Division's farewell ceremony. After we were transferred to the Garrison Division, there was no way for us to win back. This Commander Du is really shameless to the extreme." Su Lu was silent for a long time. The competition between the various divisions in the military had always been extremely cruel. If that military exercise was said to be a farewell ceremony for the 17th Division and a ceremony for the retirement of Army God Li Pifu, then Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division actually won. On one hand, it showed the combat ability of the Iron 7 Division. On the other hand, it also showed how terrifyingly strong this Commander Du's desire for victory was. To be able to personally defeat the 17th Division that was trained by Army God Li Pifu was probably the thing that Du Shaoqing looked forward to the most. Although our division is a bit weak right now, no one will forget when this matter is mentioned. Lan Xiaolong looked coldly at the Major General on the stage and said, "One day, we will get back this face and avenge our teacher." At this time, Su Lu finally understood why Lan Xiaolong always showed a very targeted disgust towards the Iron 7 Division and Commander Du Shaoqing. He was not like the other Federation officers who were respectful and distant, but also couldn't hide their admiration. The Iron 7 Division defeated the 17th Division, but I don't know if this commander can catch up to that old man in Philadelphia, he thought as he narrowed his eyes and looked at Du Shaoqing's tall and straight figure on the stage. While the two were quietly discussing, the military exercise codenamed Graduation Day had also entered a heated phase. The color blocks that represented different troops on the giant screen gradually spread across the barren hills in a gradual manner. The simulated environment of this military exercise was a small occupied administrative planet at the edge of Westwood, and the troops that would be playing the role of the Empire's army was a division of the Iron 7 Division that had been dispatched from the distant 3rd Military Region. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the situation map on the holographic screen and the real-time feedback of the military strength fluctuations. Naturally, he thought of the officers that he had spent a few months with. Today, these officers were randomly assigned to form a battlefield command headquarters and led their own troops to carry out the established tasks of the military exercise. They were originally outstanding military talents, and they had also received comprehensive training. Whether it was commanding or tactical courage when leading the attack, there was no problem. However, when he thought that their opponent was the Iron 7 Division, Su Lu was a little worried. After all, he was also one of the instructors, and he really hoped that they could produce a good result. However, the situation of the military exercise did not develop as he had hoped. Su Lu was not a professional officer, and he had not received any relevant education. However, judging from the data fed back from the light beam and the frosty faces of the generals of the Federation, he knew that the troops led by the graduates were not in an advantageous situation right now. The image of the mountain captured by the precision satellite appeared on the holographic screen after the data was restored. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the soldiers wearing dark-colored digital camouflage uniforms on the holographic screen. He was deeply shocked by the cold aura that the other party exuded. On the rostrum, Du Shaoqing slowly took off his gloves and put them in his left hand. His right hand touched the lower beam of his sunglasses. The curves on his face seemed to have been carved by a knife. He still stood straight, displaying the bearing and demeanor of a professional soldier. I've been pretending to be cool in the training base for more than 2 months. I thought that I had grasped the essence of it, but after seeing it today, I realized that my level is still far from it. Looking at Du Shaoqing, the role model of a professional military officer, Su Lu couldn't help but feel endless emotions. However, for some reason, he felt a sense of discomfort, but he didn't know where this feeling came from. Right at this moment, a burst of rapid discussion came from the rostrum. On the screen, the two sides of the military exercise had already come into contact on the Eastern Front. The battle was about to start. The color blocks that represented the military strength began to disintegrate and collapse, especially at the hilly terrain on the side. Both sides placed their special mecha battalions there. The heavy alloy mechas crushed the green and yellow forest, fiercely clashing together. The battle was extremely intense. Chapter 333. Su Lu looked at Du Shaoqing and thought about how the other person seemed to have a natural cold and majestic aura as a professional military officer, compared to the awkwardness he felt when he drew mountains instead of hills. He couldn't help but sigh softly. Although his voice was low, it still fell into the ears of the members of Team 7 next to him. From the beginning of the military exercise, the members of Team 7 had been standing in a scattered manner. When they heard Su Li's sigh, including Major Lan Xiaolong, everyone's spirits were lifted. They nodded like they were pounding garlic. They thought to themselves, who couldn't tell that you were faking it when you were pretending to be cool in class? But the teacher on the stage wasn't pretending to be cool, he was really cool. If the military officers and students who were currently braving the rain of bullets in the mountains and commanding the troops in battle heard Su Li's sigh, they would definitely have the same opinion. After the military exercise finished, the two sides began to make contact with each other in the predetermined terrain. The situation became extremely intense. The high-ranking military officers and their attendants on the rostrum followed the path on the stage and walked underground. There was a large empty room underground. The mechanics of the Federation's General Assembly base installed and repaired 37 large light screens and related electronic equipment yesterday. They temporarily acted as the headquarters for the graduation military exercise. A faint light fell into the space of the headquarters. The images on the light screen constantly changed. The Federal Central Computer was directly connected through the network. Using its supercomputing power, it presented all the details of the military exercise in real time for the military officers who were watching the exercise. Looking at the fierce contact battle between the two sides on the light screen, the military officers and officers in the headquarters discussed animatedly. The staff officer of the 1st Military Region who was in charge of the military exercise was busy in front of his workbench. The underground space was filled with a serious and tense atmosphere. Su Lu, who was standing inconspicuously in the corner, narrowed his eyes as he observed all of this. However, a very strange thought appeared in his mind. The high-speed electric current and data flow in the terminal workbench in front of him was that old man's clone. However, what he saw now was only electronic equipment, and there was no trace of the old man in the tuxedo. When he was young, Sulu had always wanted to participate in the mechanic officer examination of the Ministry of National Defense. For this, he had specially studied some tactical teaching materials of the federal military. However, he was not a professional soldier after all. Looking at the professional terms and terms that kept flashing on the 37 light screens, as well as the numerical curves that kept decreasing and increasing, he could not understand at all what stage the military exercise had progressed to. Lan Xiaolong glanced at his side profile and saw his awkwardness. He lowered his voice and explained a few words. Only then did Sulu roughly understand the current development of the military exercise. The Iron 7th Division, which was playing the role of the Empire's army, had gained the upper hand in the military exercise. They forcibly seized a high ground in the area 192, 220, 345 and occupied a considerable advantage. During this process, although the military officers deduced the opponent's tactical intentions in advance, they couldn't stop the advance of the Iron 7th Division. They could only watch as a big hole was torn open on their side. The Iron 7th Division was an exceptionally strong force. They were used to winning, but they would never be blinded by victory. Instead, they would develop absolute confidence and courage. Such a terrifying force had never been on the battlefield in the West Woods. Under the long-term dissatisfaction and anger, the commander of the Iron 7th Division and the ordinary soldiers all had a flame in their heart. Every time they participated in the Federation's military exercise, they wanted to spew out this flame so that it wouldn't burn their organs. They treated every military exercise as a real battle. They wanted to make up for the regrets of the entire force with the difficulties of their brothers. They wanted to prove to the Federation that they were the strongest division in the Federation. They didn't deserve to be placed in the peaceful and lonely S3 galaxy. They should go to the West Woods and even go on an expedition to the Empire. In countless military exercises, the Iron 7th Division had always won an overwhelming victory in the end. It had to be said that this had something to do with the overall fighting spirit of this division. During the military exercise, the Iron 7 Division's attacks were exceptionally fierce, causing people's hearts to turn cold. They had defeated countless of their brothers' troops, and had also established an unquestionable prestige and respect for this division and Du Shaoqing. What was even more frightening and respectable was that the Iron 7th Division didn't only know how to be fierce and inflexible. This Iron Blood Division had strict tactical discipline, sharp command, and strong practical experience. Every regiment and battalion seemed to have their own thoughts. Under the premise of a big goal and strict military orders, they could also show an extremely flexible and adaptable ability. This ability could even be demonstrated in a class segment. Every component and segment of the Iron 7th Division was as cold as ice. They were like machines that didn't know fatigue and fear, but they were also very agile. Under the control of Division Du Shaoqing, they were like living steel monsters, giving people a feeling that they were unstoppable. Sulu looked at the hologram worriedly as he listened to Lan Xiaolong's detailed explanation. He was very worried about the students in the mountain. Although the Iron 7th Division today was playing the role of the Empire's army, and logically speaking, the Military Exercise Command Center wouldn't let them win an overwhelming victory. Moreover, Du Shaoqing wasn't personally commanding, but looking at the current situation, he felt that something was wrong. Everyone in the Military Exercise Command Center probably had the same feeling. Although these professional officers had long been used to the invincibility of the Iron 7th Division in the military exercise, the other side today was an outstanding officer specially trained by the Federation to prepare for a fierce war with the Empire. In the end, it still ended up like this. The highest-ranking lieutenant general in the room, Deputy Commander Yi, had a gloomy expression. The generals and senior officers behind him also stopped talking and were silent. Occasionally, someone thought of something and subconsciously turned to look. Du Shaoqing was sitting in a chair in the corner of the command center, drinking a cup of coffee. He didn't take off his sunglasses, and his chin was slightly lowered. It seemed that he didn't care about the outcome of this military exercise at all. This was probably the temperament and confidence of an ever-victorious general. After a simple lunch at noon, the military exercise command center began to busy themselves with work again. But at this time, Lieutenant General Yi's expression was much better than it was in the morning, and the atmosphere in the command center gradually relaxed. The reason for this change was that the situation of the military exercise shown on the 37 circular holograms was developing in a direction that comforted the federal military. In the face of the Iron 7 Division's ferocious and cold offensive, although the joint column under the command of the military officers was in an extremely difficult situation, after paying an extremely heavy price, they finally stopped the enemy in the area of the Lonely Mountain Range. Lonely Mountain was the code name of the military exercise simulation sand table on the graduation day. In fact, it was an area of mountains and valleys 70 kilometers behind the base. Both sides of the military exercise had to achieve their respective tactical objectives, so this area was of utmost importance. According to Su Li's understanding, the military exercise command center named this area Lonely Mountain because in the border area of the West Woods, on a planet that was first occupied by the Imperial Expeditionary Force, there was a lonely mountain. The military officers were divided into several small groups to command the joint column of the military exercise side. After all, they were the best all-around talents in the Federation. After being caught off guard by the ferocious offensive of the Iron 7th Division in the beginning, they gradually calmed down and fully displayed their excellent commanding skills. However, the cooperation between the various groups was still a bit stiff and rusty. Any small detail on the battlefield could affect the final outcome of a battle. The reason why the joint forces were able to hold off Iron 7 Division at Lonely Ridge was because the Special Mecha Battalion of the joint forces had taken the risk of cutting in from a 30-degree angle. The Special Mecha Battalion, which had 8 MX mechas, had successfully evaded the electronic surveillance and destroyed the reserve armored force camp that Iron 7 Division had purposely left there in one fell swoop. The heavy black silhouettes of the alloy mechas were like silent giants. With agility that did not match their bodies, they quickly advanced on the rugged mountain path, splitting up and launching surprise attacks. The generals in the military exercise command center watched the screen and couldn't help but gasp in amazement. This was the first time the Federation's new MX mecha had displayed its true power in a large-scale battle. It completely overturned everyone's previous impression of mecha being cumbersome and powerful, and achieved very clear results. The Black MX mecha leading the charge of the Special Mecha Battalion's tactical movements were extremely precise and fierce. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he watched the mecha's movements. He immediately determined that the pilot inside was definitely Hua Xiaoxi. He had taught them for more than 2 months and was so familiar with the mecha movements of these officers that he could replay them in his mind. Naturally, he could tell who the pilot was through certain movement habits and details. Hua Xiaoxi was the joint first in the mecha assessment, so he naturally had to assume the role of the main attacker of the mecha battalion. 8 MX mecha meant that 8 officers were not in the command center of their respective units. Instead, they were charging on the front lines of the battlefield. He had watched for a long time before discovering that Zhou Yu was not among these 8 MX mecha. After thinking about it for a while, he understood. Although Zhou Yu was very good at mecha piloting, at the same time, he was also the number 1 in the tactical deduction test. He was only slightly worse than Ah Yuan. For this military exercise, he must have stayed in the command center of the joint column to be in charge of commanding the entire column. Thinking about how Zhou Yu was currently commanding the joint column to block the cold and terrifying attack of the Iron 7th Division at Silent Hill, and then thinking about how the MX mecha that was incomparably close to him would definitely shine brightly in this military exercise, Su Lu was like a rock. He couldn't help but feel a sliver of pride. Unfortunately, he would not be able to learn the ability to command troops from this military exercise. Every profession has its own specialization, Sulu thought to himself somewhat self-deprecatingly. If he had been the commander on the battlefield, any one of these officer cadets whom he had scolded for so long would have been able to annihilate the troops he was leading. This was the difference between them. Thinking of this, he suddenly thought of that teacher who had not personally commanded today. Glancing over from the corner of his eye, he saw Du Shaoqing sitting solemnly in his chair, his expression as cold as ice. But for some reason, Sulu felt that there was an invisible curve at the corner of the other's lips, expressing some sort of disdain and contempt. The graduation drill used a real simulated battlefield, using a 17% ratio. The relevant battle scale, firepower calculation, and time were all calculated according to this ratio, representing 1/6 of the real battlefield environment. When it was close to evening, the graduation drill officially ended. A total of 5 tactical objectives had been set for this military exercise. Under the brilliant display of the MX mecha and the precise and calm command of the officer cadets, the combined column had made a strong counterattack in the latter half of the drill. In the end, they had completed 2 of the objectives with the help of the attack group at the last moment. And the Iron 7th Division, which had gone into battle in a conventional manner, was as strong as ever. This iron-blooded troop completely ignored the unexpected blow they had received in the latter half of the drill, silently and even somewhat calmly completing 3 of the tactical objectives. The calmness of the Iron 7th Division was particularly evident during the process of the troops returning to camp after the drill. The screen in the command hall was clearly broadcasting the scene over there. From the senior officers of the Iron 7th Division to the most basic gunner, the expressions on their faces were calm, cold, and proud. This kind of pride seemed to be forever on their faces, this kind of calmness seemed to be something they would never forget. A troop that was used to winning was indeed very frightening, just like their teacher. The people in the military exercise command center were already quite satisfied with this result, and traces of a smile appeared on Lieutenant General Yi's face. The federal military had long been used to the victories of the Iron 7th Division. Today, the combined column under the command of the officer cadets had not lost too badly. Although the defensive line would definitely have collapsed if they had held on for a standard day, this was still the most evenly matched military exercise in many years. These officers that the Federation had focused on grooming did not lose face for the military. After the military exercise ended, the various participating troops left the base one by one. Sulu looked at the military transport ships that covered the sky and couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. It was said that the Federation was lacking in crystal resources, but for the sake of a military exercise, they were able to transport thousands of people from S2. It seemed that in order to prepare for war with the Empire, the Federation really was willing to pay any price. Immediately after, he turned his head and looked at the officers lined up in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and smiled slightly. At this time, the instructors were all standing on the other side. He was only the instructor of the mecha class, so it was naturally not convenient for him to stand out and say anything. However, his mood was revealed through his expression. Although he was young, these officers in front of him were still considered his students. This was probably a sense of achievement that came from being a teacher. The officers did not try to hide the smiles on their faces. Although they were all proud people, they had enough reason to be proud of the fact that they were able to fight so well against the Iron 7th Division after forming a team at the last minute and commanding troops they were not familiar with. Zhou Yu and Hua Xiaoxi were the focal figures among the officers because in this military exercise, Zhou Yu had been responsible for the overall tactical deduction, while Hua Xiaoxi had been responsible for the most dangerous ambush. The 2 of them had contributed the most. Hua Xiaoxi's eyebrows were raised in unspeakable joy. Zhou Yu, on the other hand, maintained his gentlemanly appearance, smiling in response. Right at this time, the slightly chaotic ranks suddenly quietened down, because the general in charge of inspecting and summarizing had already walked over. What was completely unexpected was that the person who had walked over was actually the commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing. The field instantly fell silent. The officers straightened their chests, the emotions in their eyes burning. If they could be praised by Du Shaoqing, it would be an irresistible honor for any officer. The monotonous sound of footsteps rang out. Du Shaoqing, wearing sunglasses, walked over with a cold expression. 3 officers from the Iron 7th Division followed behind him. When he reached the right side, the 3 officers stopped in their tracks. Du Shaoqing did not stop. His shiny military boots stepped slowly on the ground, as if landing on the hearts of the officers. He walked from the left to the right of the formation, then stopped. He looked coldly at the officers, his thin lips slightly parted, and his words were as sharp as knives. Known as the most outstanding officer in the Federation, after 8 months of training, all you end up with is a bunch of trash. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.